Chapter 3001. The reason why Luo Fan had regained control over this bird was naturally because Luo Fan had ascertained the limitations of this prison. Since he was certain that the prison itself could not extend its tentacles too far, much less into the deeper layers of the ocean of nothingness, he had used his mind clone to refine the projection's consciousness and bring the projection's reincarnation back under his control. Reality had proven him right. This projection's consciousness was easily taken over by his consciousness, and it transformed back into his projection. The entire process was so easy that it was as if this projection's consciousness wasn't in the prison. Instead, it was right beside the consciousness clone. The current situation appeared to be quite complicated, but it was actually quite simple. It was just that the clones and incarnations of these cultivators didn't have the same opinion. Some of them wanted to break free from this prison and reunite with their true bodies, while others clearly didn't want to. The groundhog was clearly still attached to its true body, and it wanted to reunite with its true body. Meanwhile, this ferocious tiger was one of those clones that didn't want to reunite with its true body. These two different choices clearly had their own reasons. In the eyes of the groundhog, it was only a clone of its true body, and it still believed that it was one with its true body. As such, it naturally wanted to become complete again, and it also wanted to fuse with its true body. However, the situation was different for this ferocious tiger. This prison had completely cut off his connection with his main body. To him, he had clearly become an independent entity. His thoughts, his sense of self, his strength, his body, his memories, and everything else all belonged to him alone. No one else, even its true body, could take all of this away from it. Under these circumstances, it was naturally extremely resentful toward the idea of reuniting with its true body. To him, the existence that wanted him to reunite with his main body would naturally become an enemy that wanted to kill him. Of course, he would definitely want to kill him as soon as possible. This difference in perception determined their different choices. At this moment, the ferocious tiger didn't say anything, nor did its movements slow down. After realizing that it had missed its target, it turned around and once again pounced towards the bird. Its body released a strong, killing intent, and it was like a legendary monster as it bit towards the bird, which was the projection of Luo Fan. Through the previous confrontation, Luo Fan had clearly figured out the principle of the prison. Through such a principle, he had forcefully sublimated a little supernatural power from within his body. At this time, with the help of this extraordinary ability, his body seemed to be hiding in another dimension. No matter how the ferocious tiger pounced on him, it could not hurt him at all. Through his understanding of the principles of confinement, he could sublimate extraordinary abilities from within his own body. This method was like trying to make fire out of water. According to the understanding of ordinary living beings, this was like trying to fish from a tree. It was something that was absolutely impossible to succeed. However, it was obvious that this was only in the eyes of ordinary people. In fact, in this prison, almost all the living beings with extraordinary abilities had used this method to obtain such extraordinary abilities. The reason for this was very simple. Although the principle of confinement was completely applied to living beings, it was a kind of confinement that restricted power and extraordinary abilities. However, after this confinement was completely integrated into the island, it had already become an extremely crucial rule of the island. Since it was a rule, it was naturally something that could be comprehended, mobilized, and used by experts at the level of the six tribulations. Even if this rule was to imprison all transcendence and all supernatural powers, it was still the same. For example, for ordinary people, it might seem absurd to want to make fire out of water, but as long as they had a thorough understanding of water and fire, they could conduct electrolysis of water and turn it into hydrogen and oxygen. Then, they would naturally be able to easily ignite the hydrogen and use the oxygen to give birth to fire. In other words, as long as there was an intermediate state and an intermediate transition, they would naturally be able to do something as absurd as making fire out of water At this time, the extraordinary abilities that many living beings obtained from the principles of confinement were also based on a similar principle. Of course, it was the principle of confinement, after all, and it was already rather unbelievable to be able to use it to obtain extraordinary powers. It was naturally impossible for one to be able to use such extraordinary powers to enhance one's strength as many times as one could, with ordinary rules, and eventually achieve an unbelievable realm. With this principle of confinement, the many cultivators could only barely grasp some extraordinary abilities that were dozens or even hundreds of times stronger than ordinary living beings. Such extraordinary abilities were already heaven-defying for ordinary living beings. But for the many cultivators who were at least 6 tribulations, it was only an insignificant power. Not to mention, compared to their original strength, there was a huge gap between them and any cultivators who had truly stepped onto the path of cultivation, or even cultivators who had not become immortals. Therefore, at this time, the island still maintained this pure and natural appearance, which was why the cultivation world had not been born again. If these living beings were ordinary living beings who could obtain abilities that were dozens or even hundreds of times stronger than ordinary living beings, they would naturally be overjoyed to reestablish order and directly create a cultivation system and cultivation world that relied on such extraordinary abilities. However, it was obvious that the living beings here were not ordinary living beings. Even though they looked like ordinary living beings, they were ultimately powerhouses who were above 6 tribulations. For such powerhouses, this extraordinary ability that was only dozens or at most hundreds of times stronger than ordinary living beings was not much different from the level of ordinary living beings. Under such circumstances, they naturally would not waste their experience to create a cultivation world and cultivation system that was rooted in this extraordinary ability, for this ability that was not much different from that of ordinary living beings in their eyes. It was precisely because of this that even though the prison had been built for so many years, and even though they had obtained extraordinary powers billions of years ago, the prison was still the same as before, maintaining the primitive appearance it had at the beginning. At this moment, Luo Fan's mind was attuned to the restraining power that the prison imposed on all living beings. His body constantly adjusted according to the attunement of his mind. Countless indescribable changes were happening to his body at every moment, causing every single cell in his body to squirm. They continuously released various types of energy that were born from stress and began to gather. In the end, they gathered into a gurgling stream in his body, causing his body to become more and more illusory. The gurgling stream kept accumulating in his body, increasing as the ferocious tiger pounced at him. In the end, at a certain moment, when the extraordinary ability that the ferocious tiger grasped, in other words, that astonishing killing intent, suddenly seeped into the dimension that Luo Fan was hiding in, the gurgling stream that kept gathering suddenly stopped. Soon after, an indescribable green light suddenly appeared between his chest and abdomen. As the green light appeared, Luo Fan's body, which was the flying bird's body, trembled and disappeared without a trace. Even a shadow of his body could no longer be seen. Faced with this situation, the ferocious tiger suddenly froze. Previously, no matter how the flying bird changed, even if it hid in another dimension, it could still vaguely sense its existence. Even if it could not come into contact with the other party, it could still lock onto the other party's position and not let it leave completely. It was precisely because of this that it did not choose to give up at that time, and it kept thinking of ways to deal with Luo Fan. In the end, just now, when it finally confirmed Luo Fan's hiding method through that lock, and finally began to use its extraordinary ability to seep into the dimension that Luo Fan was hiding in, it suddenly realized that Luo Fan had actually broken free from its lock. How could it not be shocked by this discovery? Just as it was in shock, a claw suddenly appeared directly between its brows. Under this claw, the ferocious tiger's skin, fur, and bones seemed to be completely non-existent, and they did not cause any obstruction to the claw at all. The claw directly penetrated the ferocious tiger's head. Soon after, the ferocious tiger let out a shrill cry, and blood flowed out of its 7 orifices. There was even a faint turbid white color mixed in. Then, the ferocious tiger crashed to the ground, and it died a violent death. At this moment, a subtle spiritual light flashed in the ferocious tiger's body, and it was about to disappear. This spiritual light was obviously the ferocious tiger's consciousness. At this moment, it was clearly going to reincarnate and be reborn. At this time, how could Luo Fan let it reincarnate? Although he understood the ferocious tiger's choice, he felt that it did not want to reintegrate with its main body and wanted to maintain its own independence, which was a heinous act. However, this did not mean that he could forgive the other party for wanting to kill him. Your choice is your choice, but you have to bear the consequences of your choice. At this moment, the bird appeared above the spiritual light out of thin air, and it directly covered the spiritual light with its claws, and it no longer moved. At this moment, the extraordinary ability in the bird's body had already undergone a transformation, and its life essence had also been improved a lot because of this transformation. At this moment, it clearly had the ability to imprison that consciousness. After its death, that consciousness finally felt that something was wrong. Don't. It was a man's voice, an extremely rough man's voice. This was also the first time that Luo Fan heard the cultivator behind the ferocious tiger speak. It was a pity that the first thing that came out of his mouth was to beg for mercy. Sorry. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Then, it exerted force with its claws, and the spiritual light in its claws was instantly extinguished, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. At this moment, some kind of subtle fluctuation surged in all directions. This was a kind of spatial fluctuation. It was extremely faint and even a little illusory, but it was indeed a spatial fluctuation. The extraordinary ability that the bird's body stimulated was related to space. As soon as this ability was activated, it could only allow the bird to escape into another dimension. Or rather, it could only create a dimension that could only accommodate the bird and allow it to escape into it. However, before this, the extraordinary ability that he had stimulated had an indescribable sublimation, and it finally broke through its limits. The dimension that he could create was no longer as narrow as before, and the number of dimensions that he could create was also no longer as limited as before. Moreover, he could no longer only hide in it like before. After this sublimation, he was able to easily deal with the ferocious tiger, whose body was clearly much more powerful than his. Fellow Taoist, you're going overboard. Suddenly, a voice boomed out from the void. Following this voice, a huge shadow appeared on the bird's body. It was a shadow in the shape of a huge bird. He looked up, and sure enough, there was a huge eagle descending from the sky, swooping down toward him. There's no need to find excuses. It's just for independence. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. At this moment, he could clearly sense that the many spying gazes in all directions suddenly disappeared. From a moment that ferocious tiger appeared, it could even be said that from the moment that groundhog appeared, there were already many spying gazes hiding in the surrounding forest. It was precisely because of this that the ferocious tiger was able to appear in such a timely manner. Even though it failed in the end, however, at this moment, after Luo Fan easily destroyed the ferocious tiger's consciousness, most of the owners of those gazes were clearly already afraid, and they no longer dared to fight with him. The eagle that descended from the sky was the kind of powerhouse that thought that it was stronger than Luo Fan, and it was not afraid of what Luo Fan had done before. At this moment, it planned to directly attack Luo Fan, who was in an extremely poor state, with its best state, while the aftermath of the battle between Luo Fan and the ferocious tiger had yet to subside. It wanted to take advantage of the situation to get rid of Luo Fan. The eagle did not respond at all to Luo Fan's words at this moment, and it only swooped toward Luo Fan with a violent gust of wind. As it swooped over, its body shone with golden light, and an extremely sharp aura seeped out of the golden light, as if there were countless sharp blades descending from the sky. Genius 1 second, remember this website address. Mobile version. Chapter 3002. Just this sharp aura alone was enough to tell what kind of extraordinary ability this eagle possessed. At the very least, it was clear what kind of ability it displayed. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure flickered and disappeared once more. However, in the instant that he disappeared, the sharp golden light flashed and changed positions. The eagle, along with the beam of light, had already turned from its original straight downward trajectory to a diagonal upward trajectory. This sudden change in direction would definitely be extremely awkward and difficult for an ordinary creature to do, but this eagle did it so naturally and smoothly. It was as if going down would naturally turn diagonally upwards. Only this could be considered as conforming to the laws of the world. Just this change in angle was enough to show that the eagle's control over his body was far superior to that of an ordinary human's. It could be said that just from this level of control, the amount of external energy that this eagle could draw from his body was at least 1,000 times greater than his own. To be able to possess extraordinary abilities in this prison that almost completely imprisoned all extraordinary beings, and to be able to easily manipulate such powerful energy, this was enough to show how extraordinary this creature's original body was. From a certain point of view, this creature was clearly very confident in daring to come forward to deal with Luo Fan at this moment. Boom! A thunderous boom suddenly erupted from the point where the eagle's golden light had struck. A circle of seemingly real ripples began to spread in all directions from the point of impact, as if some invisible existence had been hit at this moment. Soon after, Luo Fan's projection and the illusory bird directly appeared in the middle of the ripple. The ripples were so substantial, and the roar was so loud. No matter how one looked at it, it was like an earth-shattering impact. However, even at this moment, the illusory bird did not waver in the slightest in the face of this impact. Instead, it looked around in surprise. At this moment, shock appeared in the eagle's eyes as it cried out in alarm. The sharp golden light that it had emitted instantly began to sweep around the bird, piercing through it hundreds of times. However, no matter how he stabbed, no matter which part of the bird he stabbed, the bird's expression didn't change at all. No matter how the light swept, no matter how mysterious its trajectory was, it was unable to truly harm the bird. It was as if the bird was just a phantom, moving through the air in an exquisite trajectory. It seemed slow, but was actually fast, bypassing all obstacles. The eagle tried its best to stop it, and even twisted its body frantically to avoid the bird. However, in the end, the bird, which was Luo Fan's projection, didn't encounter any obstruction at all and landed on the eagle's head. Just like how it faced the ferocious tiger, its claws sank into the eagle's head. Immediately after, the eagle let out a mournful scream. In the blink of an eye, blood flowed out of its 7 orifices and brain matter flowed everywhere. It was no longer alive. Without waiting for it to fall, a speck of light rushed out of the eagle's body and into the depths of the void. At this time, an invisible barrier appeared around the spiritual light. There seemed to be an illusory world within the barrier, another dimension. No matter how the spiritual light flickered, even if it pulled out a long line in the void, it couldn't really penetrate the barrier and escape. Immediately after, the barrier collapsed. As it collapsed, the spiritual light also completely collapsed and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. With this change, the surrounding peeping gazes instantly disappeared without a trace. The forest around the bird fell into a deathly stillness, as if there were no living creatures in the forest. Luo Fan's methods were simply too terrifying. No matter how intense their battle in this prison was, it wasn't enough to completely erase the other party's consciousness. First of all, it was naturally not necessary. They were all prisoners of this prison, and even if there was any conflict between them, it was only a conflict between prisoners. After death, the resentment would naturally disappear. Naturally, there was no need to target the other party's consciousness. Secondly, he couldn't do it. After a living being died, its consciousness would be reincarnated. This was determined by the rules of this prison. Under such circumstances, if one wanted to harm the consciousness that emerged after a living being's death, it would be an exaggeration to say that it was challenging the rules. However, one should at least be able to slightly shake the rules. Clearly, if one could shake the rules, how could so many prisoners not be able to transcend after hundreds of millions of years? With all these restrictions, this kind of battle would naturally be limited. At this time, the decisiveness that Luo Fan displayed was naturally even more shocking. For a moment, Luo Fan felt that there was already an invisible barrier between him and the other prisoners. This barrier made it so that no living being was willing to communicate with him at all. However, Luo Fan didn't care about this. The bird that he transformed into did not leave the forest. Instead, he built his nest, or rather, his cave abode, somewhere in the forest. His transcendent ability was of great use in the process of building a nest or a cave residence. In fact, compared to fighting, this extraordinary ability seemed to be more suitable for building a nest or cave abode. This cave abode was hidden on a tree that was so thick that it would take 7 or 8 people to encircle it. It seemed to be real and illusory at the same time. Entering it was like entering another world. Even the prison's confinement was slightly weakened in the cave abode. The confinement method of this prison isn't absolute. Compared to the land of opportunity constructed by the true sages, it's still a far cry from it. In the cave abode, Luo Fan had an epiphany when he sensed the weakened confinement power. In the places of opportunity built by true saints, there were also places of opportunity that confined cultivation and extraordinary beings. In those places of opportunity, Luo Fan also relied on his own methods to regain his extraordinary ability. However, that was actually just following the rules of the places of opportunity. It was the rules of the land of opportunity that allowed him to regain his extraordinary power. That was why he was able to do so. But obviously, the situation in this prison was completely different. This prison didn't leave any opportunity for the imprisoned cultivators to obtain any extraordinary abilities. The rules were completely set up to confine the practitioners. However, in such a prison, Luo Fan was able to gain such a powerful, extraordinary ability in such a short period of time. Now, he was even about to sublimate this extraordinary ability so that it could be comprehended by analogy and truly become the foundation of extraordinary beings. This was undoubtedly because of Luo Fan's brilliant method. However, if it were not for the fact that the confinement principle of the prison itself was far less than that of the confinement rules set up by true saints, it would be impossible for him to achieve this no matter how brilliant he was. This is definitely not a prison naturally derived from the Tao Master's Road. It's a man-made prison. At this time, Luo Fan had completely confirmed part of the origin of this prison. The Tao Master's Road was jointly built by many Tao Masters. It could be called a place of opportunity. If this prison was naturally derived from the Tao Master's Road, then this prison should naturally have the absolute nature of the Tao Master's Road itself. If it had absolute nature, the confinement of the practitioners must be absolute. In such an absolute confinement, no matter how strong Luo Fan was, as long as he had not reached the true saint level, it was impossible for him to break through such confinement. Perhaps, under such absolute confinement, he could still gain some extraordinary ability, but it was definitely not obtained on the basis of this absolute confinement. It must be obtained on the basis of other special rules of this prison. Obviously, based on Luo Fan's understanding of this prison, it did not have these characteristics. Therefore, it could be confirmed that this prison was not a prison derived from the Tao Master's Road, but a prison set up by the practitioners on the Tao Master's Road. At this time, Luo Fan tasted the principle of confinement. He further judged that the existence who built this prison was an expert of the seventh tribulation. Moreover, he was a seventh tribulation expert whose strength had reached the peak of his seventh tribulation. This smell seems to be that of an individual cultivator. An inexplicable intuition emerged from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. Through all kinds of experiences in this prison, He had an intuition that the one who built this prison might not be a disciple of the Tao Master, but a powerful individual cultivator. What's his purpose? What's the use of confining these 6 tribulation experts for a 7th tribulation expert? Is it just for fun? Luo Fan frowned, and doubts kept emerging from the bottom of his heart. After determining the origin of this prison and determining the strength and identity of the existence who built this prison, he was more confused about the purpose of this prison. It seemed interesting to confine these 6 tribulation experts in this prison, but it was just for the sake of appearance. He did not see the significance of this for a 7th tribulation expert. A 7th tribulation expert did not cultivate on the 6th floor of the Tao Master's Road. If he wanted to return to the 6th floor of the Tao Master's Road, he would be going against the fundamental rules of the Tao Master's Road. If he was discovered by the Tao Master's prison, he would be punished. To build this prison at the risk of being punished and confine so many 6 tribulation experts, although they were only doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections, was also a thankless thing. Luo Fan did not see the need for its existence at all. Of course, the more it was so, the more Luo Fan wanted to find out the secret behind it. He did not believe that the 7 tribulation expert would do things without a purpose. Since it was set up in this way, it naturally showed that this setting was beneficial to him. Now that he could not figure out the purpose, it showed that he did not understand the benefits at all. And the benefits that he could not understand were obviously related to cultivation, to a certain foundation that Luo Fan lacked in the 7th tribulation realm. This also meant that if Luo Fan could figure out all this, he might be able to make up for some of his shortcomings. How could he not want to figure out the secret behind it? It seemed that he had made the right decision to come to this prison. With a slight thought, he suddenly thought of the countless islands that existed in this layer of the nothingness ocean. Was the origin of these islands the same as this prison? Were they all built by those 7 tribulation experts? Was the purpose of their existence similar to the prison in front of him? Thinking of this, in a deeper layer, the incarnation of his mind divided into projections and went to the other islands in this layer. If these projections directly entered this layer and then went to those islands, it would probably take millions or even billions of years to reach those islands. But obviously, with the method that Luo Fan chose at this time, he did not need to waste such a long time at all. Passing through the deeper layer, he only needed a few hours to directly cross the incomparably long distance in this layer of the nothingness ocean, where the prison was located, and arrived at the corresponding deeper layer of the islands. Then, under the command of Luo Fan's mind incarnation, the projections began to descend towards those islands. That's right, these projections entering those islands were similar to descending. For those islands, Luo Fan's projection appeared out of thin air within the range of those islands. It was silent and traceless. He didn't exist a moment ago, but in the next moment, he appeared within the range of those islands with an indescribably terrifying pressure. Not all of them, but it's not only this prison either. When the projections descended on those islands, Luo Fan instantly determined the origin of those islands. Among those islands, there was no prison similar to this one. However, judging from the absolute rules of those islands, most of them had nothing to do with 7 tribulation experts. The strength of their rules was at the level of a 6 tribulation expert at most. The restrictions and support for cultivators were only limited to the level of a 6 tribulation expert. Moreover, on most of the islands, there are traces of many 6 tribulation experts constructing them. With just one look, one could tell that these islands were most likely the product of multiple 6 tribulation experts constructing them together. Of course, apart from the islands constructed by many 6 tribulation experts, there were also some islands with the strength of the rules that even Luo Fan admired. The strength of the rules was quite similar to the strength of the rules in this prison. In other words, the strength of the rules on the islands constructed by 7th tribulation experts. Chapter 3003. From this, it could be seen that these islands were most likely constructed by powerhouses who had undergone 7 tribulations. It was similar to the prison in front of him. Of course, the rules of those islands were completely different from his prison, but they did not exist to confine living creatures or cultivators. There were all sorts of rules. Some were used for trading, some were used for cultivation, some were used for gambling, some were used for art, some were used for food, some were used for refining weapons, and so on and so forth. As long as one wanted to use it, one could find the corresponding category on those islands. From this point of view, this prison did not seem to be very special. After all, from the perspective of the island's purpose, this prison was only used to confine cultivators, of course. This was only from a macroscopic perspective. In reality, this prison was still very different from the other islands. At the very least, the other islands did not force cultivators to enter and leave. No matter what their purpose is, this prison's purpose is clearly more urgent. Luo Fan made a judgment in his heart. With this judgment, the most convenient place to start and the easiest way to get the answer he wanted was naturally extremely clear. Obviously, starting from this prison was the best place to start. Although the prison's restriction on cultivators was stronger than expected, this caused the restrictions on cultivators to be much greater than the restrictions on the other islands, causing their strength to weaken by hundreds of millions of times. However, on the other hand, this also meant that the things that this island had done were many times more than the other islands. The more they did, the more mistakes they made, and the more flaws this prison would reveal. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan naturally began to take action. Since the dimension created by this extraordinary power could slightly weaken the prison's restriction, as long as he continued in this direction, he would naturally be able to further weaken the prison's restriction. As long as he went deep enough, he might be able to completely break free from this restriction. For the current him, this was actually not a difficult task. It was just like how he had displayed when he fought against the eagle. Previously, when he fought against the eagle, a layer of the dimension was destroyed by the eagle. Why was he still unharmed? Wasn't that because he had created a new layer of dimension in that dimension? Although the eagle's sharp golden light had already broken through the barrier of one dimension, it was still a dimension away from him. Therefore, it was naturally unable to truly harm him. He had been able to do it before, and now he was just going to deepen it a step further. To him, it was obviously not too difficult. At this moment, the bird's body began to tremble slightly. As it trembled, the bird's body began to flicker with green light. Under this cyan light, a layer of subtle shadows began to gradually appear around his body, as if they were constructed by the cyan light. After this layer of shadow appeared, it naturally began to expand and gradually disappeared into the surrounding void, as if it had completely fused with the void. As this happened, the bird once again disappeared from the cave. In the deeper layers, in the dimension that had just been born, the bird's figure appeared out of thin air. Compared to the extremely complete cave with all kinds of devices and tools, the deeper layers of the dimension seemed empty, as if it was a void. However, this time, Luo Fan was not trying to build a cave, but to test the power of this prison. Therefore, he did not care about the emptiness around him at all. Instead, he carefully sensed the changes that had happened to his body after entering the second dimension, as well as the subtle changes that had happened to his extraordinary power. After sensing it, he understood that his guess was correct. Entering the deeper layers of the dimension could indeed allow him to avoid the imprisonment of this prison to a certain extent. However, it was obvious that an additional dimension was clearly not enough to completely avoid the imprisonment of this prison. Although the imprisonment that he encountered now was slightly less than when he was in the first dimension, it was still quite limited. If he wanted to completely break free from this imprisonment, the only way was to go deeper and continue to go deeper. Of course, going deeper wasn't something that could be done just by saying it. If he really could just say it, then old Eagle wouldn't have been so easily tricked. In fact, it was extremely difficult to construct another dimension within a dimension. If one's extraordinary power hadn't evolved, it could even be said to be an impossible task. And it was extremely rare for ordinary cultivators in this prison to have their extraordinary power evolve to such an extent. Similarly, if one wanted to damage the deeper layers of the dimension, one would naturally need to evolve their extraordinary power, but this was a one-to-one correspondence. Old Eagle's extraordinary power had clearly not evolved. If he had undergone a metamorphosis, how could he not be able to break through another dimension when he was able to break through one dimension? Why would he have needed to use such a powerless and futile method to pierce through the projection of the bird in the first dimension? Thus, it was clearly extremely difficult to create another dimension within the second dimension. First, he had to stabilize this second dimension. Only by stabilizing this second dimension to a sufficient degree would it be able to withstand the creation of another dimension. Obviously, in order to stabilize the second layer of the dimension to a sufficient degree, the first layer of the dimension had to be stabilized first. After all, the second layer of the dimension was also attached to the first layer of the dimension. If he wanted to open up another layer of dimension, he would have to stabilize all of the previous layers at the same time in order to do so. Otherwise, if he didn't stabilize even one layer, the entire system would completely collapse. And this was only the first difficulty. Secondly, if he wanted to create another dimension within this dimension, then the laws of the dimension, he had to be able to withstand the existence of a deeper dimension. Otherwise, even if the dimension he had to withstand was stable enough, the construction of a deeper dimension would cause it to fall into complete chaos. And this was also a long chain, just like the first condition. It could be said that when a number of dimensions reached a certain number, the first dimension might be more complex and stable than the space-time of the outside world. Of course, from a certain point of view, this was actually not very possible. After all, the first dimension also needed to be attached to the space-time of the outside world. If the first dimension was really above the space-time of the outside world, then the space-time of the outside world would obviously be unable to bear the burden and would not be able to withstand any more overlapping dimensions. This was the difference between this extraordinary power and the power to construct the dimension extracted from the light of the world. If the power extracted from the light of the world was used to construct the dimension, it would have almost no impact on the space-time of the outside world. No matter how many layers were stacked, even if there were hundreds of millions of layers, it would not affect the space-time of the outside world in the slightest. In contrast, the dimension constructed by this extraordinary power was obviously different. Every additional layer would put great pressure on the layer of space-time that it was attached to. In this case, the number of overlapping dimensions that a world could withstand was naturally extremely limited. Of course, the result of the conflict between the space-time of the outside world and the number of layers of dimensions was actually what Luo Fan wanted to see. If the number of overlapping dimensions increased to a level that the space-time of the outside world could not withstand, what would happen? Would the space-time of the outside world collapse completely, allowing him to directly escape from his prison, or would the shackles on him be completely broken and he would no longer be confined by this prison, or would there be an even stronger shackle that would restrain his extraordinary power? Or would there simply be a powerhouse who was not bound by the shackles appearing to get rid of him? He was rather looking forward to which of these possibilities would appear. And as long as a certain possibility appeared, Luo Fan would be able to use it to see many things that he could not see clearly before. As for whether the changes would harm the bird or even directly kill it, it wouldn't affect him at all. After all, no matter what, this was only his projection and the reincarnated bird. Even if he lost it, what would it affect him? If this projection could not achieve his goal and could not let him know what the purpose of the powerhouse behind this prison was, he would at most get another projection in. The risk was so small, and the reward was so great. How could Luo Fan not take this risk? The two requirements needed to construct a deeper layer of the dimension obviously required the continuous transformation of extraordinary power. This was the case whether it was to make the dimension more stable or to make the rules of the dimension more complicated. If an ordinary cultivator was faced with this situation, he would definitely scratch his head. How could it be easy to transform extraordinary power that was stimulated from the shackles? If it was that easy, prisoners who had undergone a metamorphosis in their superpowers would not be as rare as phoenix feathers and Chelan horns. But obviously, this was not a problem for Luo Fan at all. First of all, Luo Fan's strength was already at the peak of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. This level of strength was enough for him to have knowledge and wisdom that far surpassed that of ordinary powerhouses. Secondly, he was still connected to his main body, and any problems that this projection encountered here might be big problems that were difficult to solve for the projection that was shackled, but from the perspective of the main body that was completely unshackled, those were obviously just small problems. With such convenience, it would obviously be extremely easy for this extraordinary ability to transform. Of course, if it was only these two advantages that Luo Fan had, the transformation of this extraordinary power might be able to be promoted a few times, but it could not really go on forever. Only with the cooperation of the environment could it be possible to turn the impossible and allow this kind of transformation to happen continuously. And the cooperation of the environment was obviously present at this time. Don't forget, every time he went deeper into the dimension, the shackles of the prison on the bird would weaken a little. The weakening of the shackles was naturally equivalent to loosening the suppression on the bird's extraordinary power, which was equivalent to reducing the difficulty of its extraordinary power's transformation. With this bit of cooperation for Luo Fan, the transformation of the extraordinary power that the projection mastered was obviously a matter of course. In the next month, the extraordinary power that the bird mastered had transformed a total of 36 times. And in the process, the cave abode that seemed illusory yet real in the forest also had as many as 36 layers superimposed. Now, the first layer of the dimension had undergone a huge change compared to before. The stability and complexity of its space had already approached the space-time of the outside world. Apart from that, there was already an inexplicable vitality vaguely being born in its interior out of thin air. It was as if the dimension was really transforming into a complete world. Because of this change, the cave abode had become even more illusory than a month ago. This seemed a little difficult to understand. After all, the dimension had become closer to the space-time of the outside world, so it should look more real and more similar to the space-time of the outside world. Why was it even more illusory? However, this was actually a natural change. This was because the dimension was originally set to be illusory, and it was difficult to distinguish between real and fake. It could be said that this kind of illusory yet real was originally a fixed attribute of the dimension. If this attribute was destroyed, it would be equivalent to completely destroying the dimension. Therefore, no matter how the dimension changed, even if it surpassed the space-time of the outside world and became more complicated and stable than the space-time of the outside world, this dimension was definitely illusory yet real. Moreover, it might be even more illusory than it was now, and the illusory attribute would be even stronger. At this time, Luo Fan's projection, the bird, had already appeared in the 36th layer of the dimension. Compared to before, the aura of the bird was now more than tens of thousands of times stronger. The bird back then seemed to be just an ordinary animal that had mastered some extraordinary power. No matter what, it was still in the category of ordinary animals. But now it looked like a god or demon god, a terrifying god that seemed to be able to destroy the world at any time. The aura of its body and the green light around its body filled the entire dimension, making it seem like the whole dimension had become a god's kingdom. Chapter 3004. At this moment, the bird was hovering in the center of the dimension. The aura around its body was surging, and there were faint sounds of thunder rumbling in the depths of the surrounding void. At this moment, he already knew clearly that the next structure of the dimension would be the time for the result to appear. Whether he would lead the dimension to break through the shackles of this prison, or whether there would be other shackles added to it, or whether some powerhouse would arrive, the answer to all his questions would be revealed the moment the next layer of dimension was constructed. Faced with such a situation, although Luo Fan did not hesitate, he still paused for a long time before taking the next step. There was naturally no need to hesitate. These days, he had repeatedly constructed 36 layers of dimensions. Now that the result he had been waiting for was about to appear, how could he hesitate at this juncture? The reason why he paused for a long time was actually very simple. It was because he wanted to make use of this pause to prepare for all the changes that would follow. After all, he could predict that there would be shocking changes. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan be willing to accept the arrival of changes without caring about anything? In the end, he would not be able to get what he wanted because he was not prepared enough. Therefore, it was obviously extremely necessary for him to stop and make preparations at this time. After experiencing the transformation of the extraordinary ability 36 times, the extraordinary ability of Luo Fan's projection had now been raised to an unbelievable level. Now, he wanted to build another layer of dimension. Although the process was the same as before, it was the same as before. Although the process was the same as before, his movements seemed to be many times easier. It felt like he was just thinking about it, and the previous 36 layers of dimensions changed at the same time. Amidst the changes, the avian godfiend's figure became more and more blurry. It felt as if it was gradually disappearing from this dimension. In fact, it was not as if it was disappearing. He was indeed disappearing from this dimension. This was because at this moment, he was constructing a brand new, deeper layer of the dimension, and his body was also gradually entering that dimension as the construction process went on. At this time, the construction process of the 37th level of the Yuan had already completely synchronized with the stabilization and multiplying process of the previous 36 levels. When each of the 36 levels of Yuans had completed their transformation, the 37th level of Yuans would also be born. At this moment, in the outside world of the dimension, the void started to distort slightly. It was as if a piece of paper had been crushed by a stone. At this time, the space-time of the outside world was also faintly unable to withstand the pressure of that dimension. All of a sudden, chains appeared out of thin air one after another, directly wrapping around the seemingly illusory and real cave dwelling on the tree, which was also the dimension that Luo Fan had opened up. These countless chains looked rather illusory. At first glance, they seemed to be nothing more than the shadows of chains. Immediately after, in the next instant, the chains suddenly trembled slightly and wrapped around the cave abode, which was also the dimension. La 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 la. At this moment, a strange sound instantly came from the point where the chain and the dimension came into contact. Along with this sound, the originally collapsed void gradually transformed into another strange form, a form that was similar to a liquid. At this moment, the surrounding void seemed to have turned into seawater. The cave abode in the void, and the layers of dimensions were like a strange bubble floating in the sea, although it could still be clearly seen. Although it was still quite obvious, there was not much difference in essence from before. After such a change, the layers of the cave abode that had originally collapsed the surrounding void and the layers of dimensions could no longer affect the surrounding void. The inexplicable sense of transcendence that originally existed in this cave abode also disappeared without a trace. A new shackle. At this time, in the 37th level of Yuan's, Luo Fan already had an understanding. This was clearly the manifestation of a new shackle gathering from the void after he touched the previous limit of the prison. This was not beyond Luo Fan's expectations. At least this treatment did not exceed one of the possibilities that he had previously guessed. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan showed a hint of joy on his face. This meant that the existence behind this prison might be more powerful than he had imagined. In other words, the foundation of this prison was more powerful than he had imagined. At this time, the 37th level of Yuan's was finally constructed. And because of the layers of construction, the first level of Yuan's had already surpassed the level of the normal prison space-time in the outside world, be it in terms of stability or complexity. However, it obviously did not surpass the liquid-like space-time that was wrapped around the first level of Yuan's. Therefore, at this time, he was still in this prison, still suffering from the shackles of this prison, and still unable to transcend. But just strengthening the space-time like this is only treating the symptoms and not the root cause, right? Is there really no other way? Luo Fan sensed the surrounding space-time and thought to himself. Facing the liquid-like space-time around him, Luo Fan did not even need to change his approach. As long as he continued, the space-time would eventually fall into the predicament of the previous normal space-time. In other words, one day it would definitely be surpassed by the first level of Yuan's again. By then, the problems that the prison had encountered before would obviously appear again. It could be said that doing this would only push back the crisis that had already broken out, and it would not be of much help in solving the real problem in essence. If the existence behind the prison only had such means, he would be quite disappointed. As Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly, another transformation of his extraordinary ability appeared on his body. His extraordinary ability had become even more powerful after this transformation. Naturally, the aura around him had also become even more vast and majestic. Immediately afterward, he did not do anything, but his figure became blurred again. At the same time, the previous 37 levels of Yuan's also changed correspondingly, and they began to become more stable and more complicated. After a while, the new dimension was completely formed, and Luo Fan's projected figure completely disappeared from the 37th level of Yuan's and appeared in the 38th level of Yuan's. At this moment, the liquid-like void outside the first layer of dimension, which was also outside the cave abode, began to tremble more and more intensely. In this agitation, circles after circles of ripples continuously reverberated in the liquid-like void. The chains that were wrapped around the cave abode became more and more substantial at this time, as if they were stimulated and began to exert force. With this change, the ripples in the liquid-like void also began to gradually calm down. It was as if the source of the ripples had been forcefully suppressed. Of course, during the process of the ripples calming down, the surroundings did not remain the same. During this process, the area occupied by the liquid-like void had unknowingly expanded by a large margin. Luo Fan was not surprised by such a change. At this time, he did not stop, but continued to use a part of the shackles that were being fought for in the next level of Yuan's to promote another transformation of his extraordinary ability. After the transformation, he naturally made great progress in all aspects and became very different from before. With the success of this transformation, he had extra strength to build a new level of Yuan's. Obviously, he would not be polite with this prison. After he had the ability to build a new level of Yuan's, he began to build a new level of Yuan's without hesitation. What happened next was a repeat of what happened before. It repeated again and again. Every time a new level of Yuan's was superimposed, the surrounding chains would become more solid, and only then would they be able to suppress the movement they caused. Every time the chains became more solid, the liquid-like void around them began to expand. Unknowingly, the 72nd level of Yuan's had already been built by Luo Fan's bird projection. At this moment, the liquid-like void had already expanded to cover the entire forest. Furthermore, the chains that were entwined in the cave dwelling that seemed to be both real and illusory had already condensed to the extreme, giving off a feeling that it had already reached its peak. With such a feeling, Luo Fan had an epiphany. As long as he continued to build another level of Yuan's, the stability and complexity of the first level of Yuan's would surpass the limits that the chains could bear. At that time, the chains would definitely collapse completely. What other tricks do I have this time? At this time, in the 72nd level of Yuan's, the bird had completely changed its appearance. The demonic aura on its body became increasingly intense. Compared to the previous levels of Yuan's, the 72nd level of Yuan's was more like a divine kingdom or a demonic kingdom. There was nothing ordinary about it, and it gave people a feeling that it was born of the world and was loved by the universe. Moreover, the bird's figure was completely different from before. Right now, he could no longer be called a bird. He should be called a birdman instead. This was because the characteristics of a bird on its body had been reduced to a certain extent. It could be said that apart from its wings, it was impossible to tell that it was originally a bird from head to toe. Apart from its wings, every other part of its body had the appearance of a born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew. In other words, it had the appearance of a human. The metamorphosis of the extraordinary power gradually took effect on its body, and it began to transform its body, causing it to break through the shackles of the reincarnation body that the prison had given it time and time again. By now, the changes had almost come to an end. The bird was about to truly possess the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew, and completely recover its original appearance when it was Luo Fan's projection. From a certain point of view, this was clearly a break through the shackles of the prison. After all, returning to its original appearance would obviously break through the reincarnation rules of the prison. In other words, it would be a part of the shackles of the swordfish. Sensing this change, Luo Fan only smiled faintly, and there was an inexplicable look of anticipation in his eyes. What he was looking forward to was not regaining the born Taoism aptitude. Instead, he was looking forward to what the prison would do next. After all, as long as he constructed another layer of the dimension, then the shackles that had restricted his dimension and shattered the void of the prison would be completely destroyed by that dimension. At that time, not only would the liquid void around him collapse, but it might even directly collapse the prison, allowing it to completely transcend and escape from the shackles of the prison. He believed that such an outcome was not something that the existence behind the prison would be able to accept. Therefore, the prison would definitely take action next. There would definitely be another method to strengthen it. Of course, he only hoped that this method would not add another layer of shackles to the prison. If that was the case, it would be too disappointing. With this thought in mind, he began to construct the 73rd layer of the dimension. His body also began to gradually become illusory, and in the end, he completely disappeared from the 72nd layer of the dimension. Corresponding to his disappearance, each of the 72 levels of Yuan in front of him began to become more stable and complex. Now, the first layer of the dimension had completely transformed into the appearance of a world. Among them, there were even cultivators being born. These cultivators were the creatures of this dimension, or rather, the creatures that were born and bred in this world. They were the creatures that were born in this dimension, and they found the true essence of cultivation in the laws of this dimension. They sorted out the cultivation methods and transformed into cultivators. For Luo Fan, perhaps only a few dozen days had passed in the outside world. However, because the laws of the first layer of the dimension changed again and again, the strength of the dimension increased again and again. The flow of time in it was already completely different from the flow of time in Luo Fan's body and the flow of time in the outside world. In this world, tens of thousands of years had already passed. Chapter 3005. These tens of thousands of years were enough for the living beings born in this dimension to have a preliminary understanding of the laws of the dimension, and then summarize the corresponding path of cultivation. Of course, it was still only tens of thousands of years, and the path of cultivation they summarized was still rather shallow. At most, they could only give birth to some cultivators like itinerant immortals, who could barely break free from the limit of their lifespans. Moreover, this change was not limited to the first layer of the dimension. Similar changes began to occur in other dimensions as well. Civilizations began to gradually emerge, and cultivators gradually appeared. This change continued to weaken as the level of the dimension increased. The deeper the level of the dimension, the less life was born, and the further away it was from giving birth to a civilization and cultivators. Clearly, this was because the complexity of the laws of those dimensions continued to weaken as the level increased, and the stability of the space also continued to weaken as the level increased. Until now, the level of the dimension that could truly give birth to a cultivation civilization was only the 7th layer. Moreover, when it came to the 7th layer, rather than calling it a cultivation civilization, it was better to call it a civilization with special abilities. Although the living beings born in the 7th layer of the dimension had already discovered some extraordinary mysteries, it was difficult for them to summarize these discoveries into an orderly cultivation method that could be inherited. They could only rely on the heavens to make a living and wait for a chance to awaken. Clearly, this kind of cultivation civilization was only at the beginning, and it could not be called a true cultivation civilization. Of course, this was only a matter of time. As time passed, the living beings in this layer of the dimension would summarize more and more cultivation principles, and then use these principles to summarize orderly cultivation methods. It was just like the dimensions above it. In fact, the cultivation civilizations in those dimensions had also gone through the stages that the cultivation civilizations in the seventh layer of the dimension had gone through. This could even be said to be the dividing line between the cultivation civilizations in the many dimensions. Almost every layer of the dimension had gone through the process of the transformation between the civilization with special abilities and the civilization of cultivation. However, the civilizations that were born in different dimensions had their own characteristics and had their own way of thinking. This different way of thinking caused them to unknowingly carry their own inclinations when they summarized the principles of cultivation and the mysteries of cultivation. When these tendencies converged together, they created the different cultivation methods of those cultivation civilizations. As such, although they all went through the same process, the cultivation civilizations that eventually emerged from these dimensions were not completely the same. Instead, each layer had its own unique characteristics. In fact, the cultivation civilizations in each layer had different goals. Of course, this situation was not something to be happy about for Luo Fan. After all, although the process of the entire cultivation civilization's derivation was like a kind of miracle for Luo Fan, this kind of miracle was really too much. The number of worlds, and space-time that Luo Fan had opened up was so many that it might not even be possible to count them clearly, even if they were counted in trillions. How many of these worlds, and space-time did he not decide on the direction of the development of his civilization? It could be said that there were simply too many to count. As for the cultivation civilization that was born from a civilization that he had yet to determine the direction of its development, it was needless to say how many possible directions it could develop and how many possible ways it could develop. It could be said that he had seen far too many cultivation civilizations in these dimensions that he had yet to decide on. It could be said that he had seen far too many cultivation civilizations that were born from these dimensions. Thus, until now, Luo Fan actually did not pay much attention to the cultivation civilizations that were born from these dimensions. He did not investigate whether or not there were any hidden secrets behind these cultivation civilizations. In reality, it was almost certain that these cultivation civilizations were hiding secrets. One should not forget where these cultivation civilizations were born. The place where these cultivation civilizations were born was in the dimension that was opened up in this prison. And in the dimension that was opened up in this prison, this meant that it was constantly under the confinement principle of the prison itself, or in other words, the confinement rules. Wasn't the cultivation civilization that was developed in this kind of confinement the next stage of development of the extraordinary power possessed by the cultivators in the main body of the prison outside that dimension? It should be known that the extraordinary power that those cultivators currently possessed was actually equivalent to the level that those living beings in the seventh dimension were at. In other words, they had mastered extraordinary power, but had yet to summarize the true principles of this extraordinary power, and had yet to find a way to turn it into a cultivation legacy. With this calculation, it went without saying what the cultivation civilizations in the earlier dimensions represented. This situation seemed very inconceivable and absurd. After all, in these dimensions, even in the first dimension, only tens of thousands of years had passed. And the level of the living beings that were born from them was tens of thousands of levels lower than the level of the imprisoned living beings in the main body of the prison outside. Under such circumstances, how could they rely on only tens of thousands of years of development to far surpass the many cultivators in the main body of the prison outside, who knew how many billions of years of development? If this wasn't absurd, if it wasn't nonsense, what was it? However, it was obvious that regardless of whether it was absurd, inconceivable or not, regardless of whether he was speaking without thinking, this was how things developed. The reason was that although the development time of the living beings in these dimensions and the level of the living beings were far less than that of the main body of the prison outside, they were not as strong. However, at the same time, the The confinement of the prison in these dimensions was not as strong as that of the main body of the prison outside. Don't forget that the stability of the space in the first dimension and the complexity of the rules were far above that of the main body of the prison outside. If it wasn't for the fact that the void outside had turned into a liquid-like state under the effect of the prison itself, this level of dimension would have completely collapsed the main body of the prison outside, resulting in another layer of change that Luo Fan was extremely looking forward to. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how much the confinement rules and principles that originally acted on the main body of the prison were weakened here. It was naturally many times easier to break through this extremely weakened confinement principle than in the main body of the prison outside. On top of that, there were simply too many living beings that were born in this dimension. It could be calculated in the hundreds of billions. With all these factors added together, it was very normal for the current superimposed result to be created. In the beginning, Luo Fan did not notice the uniqueness of the cultivation civilizations in these dimensions. However, this was ultimately a change that happened in the dimension that he had constructed, and it was impossible for Luo Fuan to not notice it forever. Just as he was about to construct the 73rd dimension, he finally discovered the uniqueness of the cultivation civilizations in the previous few dimensions. I almost missed it. After realizing this, Luo Fan could not help but secretly rejoice. The cultivation civilizations were actually quite useful to him. At the very least, he was now able to borrow the cultivation civilization here to allow his projection to undergo an extremely subtle transformation. Through this subtle transformation, he could completely eliminate the remaining details of his projection that were not born with Taoism aptitude. He could also truly transform his extraordinary power into the path of cultivation. It was not because the path of cultivation summarized in the cultivation civilization surpassed the limits of Luo Fan's abilities, nor was it because Luo Fan could not comprehend the path of cultivation at all. It was because Luo Fan had never paid attention to this aspect all along. To him, his current extraordinary power was only constantly transforming and improving, and that was enough for him to use. The existence that carried these extraordinary powers was only an insignificant projection of him. Even if he cultivated this projection to be able to surpass everything and become eternal, it was still just a projection. In that case, how could he waste time and energy on such a projection? Therefore, even though he actually had the ability to transform the projection's extraordinary power, and had the ability to transform the projection's extraordinary power into the path of cultivation, while also transforming the projection at the same time, he did not focus his energy on it. It was precisely because of this that after discovering the characteristics of the cultivation civilization in that dimension, he had a great understanding. It was as if the fog that had originally covered his mind was completely lifted. Perhaps this 73rd dimension doesn't even need to be constructed at all. Such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As his thoughts changed, the extraordinary power that he mastered gradually began to transform. As the extraordinary power transformed, the wings on his back and the subtle characteristics of a bird on his body began to quickly fade. Apart from that, the godlike and demonic aura on his body began to rapidly diminish. It did not take long for it to completely disappear along with the characteristics of his body that did not belong to born with Taoism aptitude. As his aura changed, and as the characteristics of his body that did not belong to born with Taoism aptitude changed, the dimensions that resembled divine and demonic kingdoms also began to gradually retract their strong characteristics. The godlike and demonic aura quickly faded and eventually completely disappeared without anyone noticing. The dimensions seemed to have completely lost their mysteriousness, and, at a glance, seemed like an extremely ordinary dimension. As this change occurred, the many dimensions responded at the same time. In an instant, an earth-shattering thunderous roar rang out from the liquid-like void. Ripples that could be seen with the naked eye erupted from the illusion of the cave abode, and they continuously spread in all directions. Gradually, The liquid-like void stirred up violently during this process, and an irrepressible sense of destruction continuously emerged from it. At this moment, the shackles that covered the illusion of the cave abode could no longer maintain its integrity. All the shackles began to break and shatter. There seemed to be an inexplicable howl coming from the depths of the island. At this moment, all the living beings on the island suddenly felt that the shackles on them seemed to have suddenly weakened a lot. However, the shackles were quickly restored. At first glance, it did not seem to be any different from before, but if one were to sense it carefully, they would discover that the shackles seemed to have lost their previous comprehensive nature. It seemed like the original comprehensive shackles had turned into some kind of inclined shackles. Upon discovering this, many of the cultivators who were originally at the Sixth Tribulation began to get excited. Since there was a tendency, it meant that a weakness that did not originally exist had appeared. In that case, as long as they found that weakness, they would be able to break through the shackles that they could not have done before. For a moment, this thought flashed through the minds of countless living beings. Here's our chance. With this thought in mind, they began to try out various aspects of their extraordinary abilities. Luck was something that was very difficult to predict. Some living beings might need to spend hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of millions of years to obtain the answer they wanted. But some living beings might be able to obtain the answer in the next moment. On this island, there were quite a number of experts at the Sixth Tribulation who were imprisoned, including those who were extremely lucky. Of course, this kind of luck could only be counted among these powerhouses. In the eyes of all the cultivators at the sixth level of the road to Tao Master, it was extremely bad luck that they were imprisoned in this prison. In just a few breaths, some of the experts at the sixth level of the road to Tao Master grasped the weakness of the shackles and made their extraordinary abilities undergo a change that they had been dreaming of. I finally got it. A roar filled with boundless joy suddenly came from somewhere on the island. This howl contained a certain kind of aura that should never have appeared on this island. It belonged to the aura of longevity, the aura of immortality. With this howl and the appearance of this aura, the whole island was in an uproar. It's here, it's finally here. This low roar came from everywhere, containing endless expectation and excitement, as if they had finally seen hope. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3006. There were many things that the cultivators in this prison pursued. Breaking through the shackles, maintaining their independence, reuniting with their main bodies, freedom, great power, etc. It could be said that there were all sorts of strange things that they pursued. There were simply too many to count. Among these pursuits, the most important one was also the most common. Almost every cultivator pursued immortality. It should be noted that almost all the living creatures on this island were transformed from Sixth Tribulation powerhouses. For Sixth Tribulation powerhouses, their strength and realm had reached a level that ordinary living creatures couldn't imagine. Immortality was something that they had obtained hundreds of millions of years ago. It could almost be said that it had completely turned into their instinct and become an indispensable part of themselves. However, after entering and being imprisoned in this prison, this kind of immortality, which was originally an instinct and an indispensable part of their selves, was completely erased. They could only be born, grow, age, and die like ordinary living creatures. Even if their consciousness could maintain their self-awareness and memories after reincarnation, from a certain point of view, it was not much different from before. However, they were no longer immortals like before. To them, this was a great harm to their ego. Under such circumstances, how could those Sixth Tribulation powerhouses not desire to regain immortality? But now, those living creatures discovered that the immortality, which was originally regarded as the most important thing in this prison, had actually been broken through by one of their fellow prisoners. How could they not feel excited? How could they not feel excited? How could they not feel hopeful? With the stimulation of this aura, more and more cultivators began to transform their extraordinary abilities at an extremely fast speed, allowing them to break through the shackles of their lifespans and obtain immortality. This situation seemed incredible, but it was actually very normal. Those cultivators could feel that there was a weakness in the prison, a loophole, but they didn't know where it was. That was why they had to spend a lot of time looking for it. That was why they couldn't use their extraordinary abilities to break through this weakness and loophole. In other words, it was because they couldn't find it, not because they didn't have the ability. Under such circumstances, some cultivators would obtain eternal life, which was equivalent to directly pointing out their weaknesses and loopholes. In other words, he directly told them the answer they needed to spend time looking for. Under such circumstances, those cultivators naturally didn't need to waste time looking for weaknesses and loopholes. For them, all they needed to do was to work towards achieving immortality. In this way, they would naturally be able to unleash their full potential. It was only natural for him to break through this weakness and this loophole. For a time, cheers of joy could be heard from all directions. Waves of immortal aura were constantly released from the place where the roar came from. The aura began to spread across the entire island, causing the atmosphere on the island to change drastically. It could be predicted that even if Luo Fan did not act now, this island would still be completely different from now on. Immortality was almost completely corresponding to the transformation of the body. After all, in order to achieve immortality, a certain transformation of the body was needed. At least, this was the way most people obtained immortality. The restrictive loophole of the island in front of them belonged to this category. In this way, the 6 tribulation powerhouses and the many cultivators naturally began to gradually transform their bodies. One by one, the cultivators' bodies gradually turned into the appearance of born Taoism bodies. It wasn't the appearance of other strange born Taoism bodies. It was the appearance of the born Taoism bodies that Luo Fan knew. After all, this was the 6th level of the Tao Master Path. The cultivators who existed here were all cultivators from the Tao Master Great World. The born Taoism bodies of such cultivators were naturally the born Taoism bodies of the Tao Master Great World. What did the born Taoism bodies of the Tao Master Great World look like? Of course, they were in human form. In fact, the reason why Luo Fan was able to find the Tao Master Great World was because it was the source of the born Taoism bodies in human form. In this way, the innate Taoism aptitude that these 6 tribulation cultivators who were imprisoned in the prison eventually transformed into were naturally in human form. As more and more cultivators underwent this transformation, the situation of the entire island began to change more and more obviously. The connection between the many cultivators began to increase rapidly. This change was actually very normal. Although it was only a change in body shape, it did not have much of an impact on the essence of the 6 tribulation powerhouses. The 6 tribulation powerhouses were still the same 6 tribulation powerhouses. Their memories and knowledge were not much different from before. Such a change should not have caused a change in the mentality and behavior of the 6 tribulation powerhouses. However, the truth was completely different from the reason. This change in body shape had a huge impact on the mentality of the 6 tribulation powerhouses. In the past, when these cultivators did not have born Taoism bodies, they were actually quite ashamed. They were also quite disgusted with their own bodies. All living creatures had their own unique aesthetic standards. As the 6 tribulation powerhouses who were originally in human form, they naturally also had a humanoid aesthetic standard. For this kind of humanoid aesthetic, there were very few creatures that were not humanoid and did not conform to their aesthetic standards. At least, very few people would have some kind of indescribable desire for non-humanoid creatures. Therefore, when they could not transform into born Taoism bodies, and when the other 6 tribulation powerhouses could not transform into born Taoism bodies, the 6 tribulation powerhouses would obviously have an inexplicable feeling of disgust towards themselves and the other 6 tribulation powerhouses. And this kind of disgust was a huge barrier between them, making it impossible for them to recognize and communicate with each other like they did before they were all in human form. And once they transformed into born Taoism bodies, that was when they were in human form. This kind of barrier would naturally be removed. Communication would naturally increase. The increase in communication would naturally allow them to understand each other more clearly, and their connection would naturally become closer. If this continued to develop in this way, the situation of the entire island would naturally change greatly. After a long time, a special, brand new civilization might be established by them. Of course, all of this could only be known as time continued to develop. At this time, the effect of this change was that the ripples that spread out from the liquid-like void seemed to have received some kind of nourishment. They became more and more intense, and the scope of their spread became wider and wider. In the beginning, this effect caused the range of the liquid-like space-time to constantly expand and grow. However, as time passed, as this effect became greater and greater, when the liquid-like void finally expanded to a certain limit, the feeling of the liquid-like void was finally completely broken. The space-time seemed to have suddenly returned to its normal appearance. At a glance, there was no longer anything special about it. It was completely the same as any other space-time in this prison. At this moment, the cave abode in the forest that seemed both real and illusory, or in other words, the dimension, had already turned into an indescribable existence. It was even more real and illusory, and even more illusory. However, at the same time, it also gave off a completely different feeling. It was a feeling that it was above everything and had transcended everything. Transcended? At this time, Luo Fan's heart gave birth to such a realization. At this moment, he had already felt that the confinement principle and confinement rules of the prison contained in the many dimensions had disappeared without a trace. These dimensions seemed to have been opened in a place without any confinement at all. They had finally completely broken away from all the previous shackles. That's it, Luo Fan murmured in his heart. Could it be that this was the only means of the prison? Or could it be that the construction of this prison and the means of the 7 Tribulation Powerhouse were only this? At this time, Luo Fan was disappointed and vigilant. He was disappointed because he was worried that this was really the only means of the prison. If that was the case, wouldn't all the preparations and plans he had made be for naught? On the other hand, he was vigilant because he instinctively knew that this was probably not the case. There was only a very small possibility that the means of the 7 Tribulation Powerhouse would stop at this step. At this time, the 72 layers of the dimensions were slowly floating up. It was as if there was an inexplicable repulsive force acting on the layers of the dimensions, pushing them to float up continuously. With the appearance of this floating, every layer of those dimensions was also undergoing earth-shattering changes at the same time. The sudden disappearance of the confinement had an unimaginable impact on these dimensions. At this moment, an endless amount of vitality gushed out from every layer of the dimension like a geyser. With every passing moment, those dimensions became more and more lively. The structure of the living beings in those dimensions also became more and more complicated and wonderful as this process continued. As for the cultivation civilization in the first layer of the dimension, it was also rapidly improving. Apart from the changes in vitality and the transformation of the cultivation civilization itself, another kind of change also appeared in the many dimensions at the same time. Moreover, compared to those changes, this other kind of change was even more crucial and had an even greater impact. That was the change in the flow of time. It was as if there was an accelerator fusing into the layers of the dimensions, and the flow of time in each layer of the dimension kept accelerating as the dimension continued to rise. The flow of time at the very beginning was quickly surpassed. When the dimension rose to near the end of the island and was about to break through the invisible barrier above the island, the flow of time in the first layer of the dimension had already increased to more than 1 billion times that of the outside world. Although the time of the dimension's increase was only a few days for the outside world, or rather, for this prison, it was only a few 100 million years. However, for the first layer of the dimension, hundreds of millions of years had passed. After such a long period of time, the cultivation civilization that was established in the first tens of thousands of years had developed to an unbelievable level. Even in the cultivation civilization, there were already innate grand luo cultivators who could be self-sufficient and did not rely on external help. After all, the birth of innate grand luo cultivators and the birth of innate grand luo cultivators in a world, space, and dimension were two completely different concepts. If an innate grand luo cultivator hadn't been born, then the world, space, and dimension would be consuming themselves at all times. The more cultivators and living beings there were, the closer they were to collapse and perish. Because if there were no cultivators above the innate grand luo realm, then all the nutrients that living beings required to grow had to be absorbed from the world, space, and dimension. The more they absorbed, the greater the consumption of the world, space, and dimension. When such consumption arrived at a certain limit, then no matter if it was the world, space, or dimension, they would collapse and perish completely. However, once cultivators above the innate grand luo realm were born in the world, space, and dimension, the situation would become completely different, because innate grand luo cultivators were self-sufficient, and they could even create all the energy, materials, and even resources that they required to cultivate. In this way, not only would their existence not cause any depletion in the world, space, and dimension, they could instead constantly make up for the depletion caused by the appearance of other living beings. The more cultivators there were, the closer the world was to destruction. The more cultivators there were, the greater the growth of the world. That was how a world, a stretch of time, and a dimension would be affected by the presence of cultivators above the connate grand heavenly realm. At this moment, in the first layer of the dimension constructed by Luo Fan's projection, this node was broken through. A golden immortal realm cultivator had finally been born here, and they'd overcome the node of destruction and stepped onto the path of sustainable development towards the Grand Tao. Genius 1, second remember site address. Mobile version, Chapter 3007. The appearance of an innate golden heavenly realm cultivator meant that the dimension would be completely different from now on. It could be said that from now on, Luo Fan did not have to spend any effort on this dimension anymore. This dimension would be able to transform itself and continuously improve itself. In the end, it might even have a 1 in a billion chance of transforming into a real world. It was just like any other world that had given birth to an innate golden heavenly realm cultivator. So long as an innate golden heavenly realm cultivator was born in any world, it meant that the world had already opened the barrier of improvement, and it had obtained a trace of hope to become a stronger world. Of course, this hope might only be a tiny bit. In comparison, the dimension that Luo Fan constructed was malleable. Even though its starting point was slightly inferior to ordinary worlds, it had a much greater chance of becoming a world than ordinary worlds. At the instant the dimension was about to leave the prison, the living beings below suddenly roared in unison. This kind of roar seemed to contain incomparably intense pain, as if there was a steel hammer madly grinding their internal organs. The intense pain was mixed with the roars of the living beings, and it started to be vented crazily with the help of those roars. At the same time, the entire island started to tremble slightly. It was as if a living being that had been in slumber for countless years was gradually awakening. The 72 levels of dimension that Luo Fan grasped even felt an unimaginable pulling force acting on him at this instant. It was pulling him, causing him to be unable to continue ascending and transcend. As it appeared, at this moment, facing such a change, Luo Fan was secretly looking forward to it. It didn't make much sense for him to let these dimensions transcend this island. After all, he did not know what these dimensions would look like after they transcended this island. Would they transform into a world, a heavens, an island, or even directly collapse? All of these possibilities were not very meaningful to him. The reason why he allowed these dimensions to transcend this prison and this island was merely to force out the existence behind this prison and force the prison to undergo a new change. Only then would he be able to truly understand the mysteries of this prison. Only then would he be able to understand what the 7 tribulations expert behind this prison wanted to do. The ultimate goal of all this was, of course, to comprehend some of the mysteries of the cultivation of sixth and seventh tribulation experts through this method, and then assimilate it into one's own body, allowing one to grow further. Therefore, at this time, the prison gave birth to a new change, making it impossible for the dimensions he had constructed to escape. Although it seemed to create an obstacle for him, he was quite happy with the appearance of this change. Ka 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 ka. The entire prison began to squirm, and an endless amount of laws emerged from the depths of the prison. These laws were so dense that they were like the finest piece of cloth, covering every inch of the void in the entire prison, including the void where the dimension was. After these laws were verified, they frantically converged towards that dimension, causing the void around that dimension to undergo great changes. The void that was originally like nothingness had unknowingly turned into a liquid state. Then, it turned into a solid form. It looked like solidified cement. At this moment, the process of the dimension's transcendence was completely cut off. The 73rd level of the dimension had completely lost the power to continue ascending. On the contrary, it began to fall back due to the prison's pulling force, falling back into the main body of the island below. How could it be so simple? Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a slight thought, the 72nd level of the dimension began to shake violently at the same time, and an incredible power surged out of it in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the first level of the dimension began to expand at a crazy rate. As it expanded, the flow of time within it also began to accelerate. In the blink of an eye, it had already increased by thousands of times. Following this change, the cultivation civilization in the first level of the dimension began to rise at a crazy rate. In just a few breaths of time in the outside world, a quasi-sage was born in the first level of the dimension. As the quasi-sage appeared in the first level of the dimension, the resistance of the first level of the dimension to the outside world began to increase. Originally, the surrounding void seemed to have turned solid, completely freezing the 72nd level of the dimension. However, as the first sage-to-be cultivators were born in the first layer of the dimension, the stillness was gradually broken. It must be known that the cultivation civilization in the first level of the dimension was originally based on the restraining rules and principles that existed in the prison. For such a cultivation civilization, the higher the level of development, the greater the resistance against the restraining power of the prison. Evidently, the moment a quasi-sage stage cultivator was born in the cultivation civilization, it meant that the cultivation civilization in this dimension had developed to an extremely high level. It meant that the resistance it could make against the outside world had reached a certain limit. Amidst these changes, countless cracks began to appear in the seemingly solid void around them. On the other hand, on the surface of the island below, many cracks also appeared on the bodies of the creatures that were roaring crazily. It was as if those solid voids were the bodies of those living beings. In the face of this situation, Luo Fan was not moved at all. Even though the scene before him seemed to be the complete fusion of the 6 tribulation powerhouses and the restraining power of the prison, and breaking the restraining power of the prison seemed to be killing the countless 6 tribulation powerhouses, it was still the same. Luo Fan was not a moral purist, nor would he take the initiative to shoulder responsibilities that did not belong to him. The direct reason why the 6 tribulation powerhouses were injured and killed when the dimension broke free from the shackles was because the dimension was trying to break free from the restraining power. However, the fundamental reason was the mechanism of the prison itself. If the prison had not linked the restraining power of the 6 tribulation powerhouses to the life of the 6 tribulation powerhouses, how could he have affected the 6 tribulation powerhouses by manipulating the dimension to break free from the restraining power? As for completely ignoring everything because of this influence, allowing his dimension to be restrained, sealed, and pulled back to the island below, this was clearly not something that Luo Fan would do. As the dimension struggled, the solid-like space around it began to gradually collapse. As it collapsed, a large number of living creatures below, or rather, the reincarnations of the six tribulation powerhouses. A large number of living creatures continuously collapsed and died in the process. The cultivation civilization that had just sprouted in the prison suffered a destructive blow. At this moment, although the process of the dimension breaking the surrounding solid-like space and restraining power affected a large number of six tribulation powerhouses in the prison, it was clearly still limited in the end. However, it was clear that the prison's methods were still limited. Although it had fused the lives of a portion of the six tribulation experts with the imprisonment, it was still only a portion of them. Therefore, the number of six tribulation powerhouses that were destroyed was only a portion of the six tribulation powerhouses in the entire prison. At most, it only accounted for about 30% of all the six tribulation powerhouses. However, 70% of the six tribulation powerhouses below were still intact. The distribution of the destroyed six tribulation powerhouses was in a large area directly below the dimension, occupying a large area of 30% of the entire prison. Among them, the first powerhouse that Luo Fan came into contact with, Lu Tong, was one of the six tribulation powerhouses that was also destroyed along with the restraining power. At this moment, in a so-called window at the border of the island, Lu Tong had already turned into smoke and disappeared without a trace, leaving only a strange cave abode. After a long time, this place might become a relic that ordinary cultivators could explore for a long time. As the solid-like void was broken, the dimension began to transcend further. Soon, it returned to the border between the prison and the outside world, and was about to break through the boundary. As it appeared, at this moment, a leisurely voice suddenly came from the island. The words were so strange. It felt as if everything in the world was making some kind of meaningless sound at the same time and coming together to form a single sentence. Scattered to everything in the world? At this moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Through this sentence, he already knew the identity of the creator behind the prison and where the means of the seventh tribulation powerhouse was hidden. The means of the seventh tribulation powerhouse was obviously scattered and hidden in everything in the prison in an indescribable way. Even the bodies of the six tribulation powerhouses contained a part of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. After all, the original bodies of the six tribulation powerhouses had already been completely destroyed by the prison. Now that they existed in the prison, apart from the consciousness of the original six tribulation powerhouses, everything else was created by the prison itself. Under such circumstances, the seventh tribulation expert would naturally be able to hide a part of himself in their bodies. At this moment, a huge face was directly projected on the barrier between the prison and the outside world. Because of the angle, it looked like it was deep in the sea of nothingness. It was the figure of a middle-aged woman. There was no need to say much about her appearance. She was so beautiful that it was almost like the embodiment of beauty. More importantly, her temperament was completely different from that of ordinary women. She looked extremely noble and dignified, like a supreme empress who had the world in her grasp. At this moment, the middle-aged woman floated in the barrier and looked at the dimension that was breaking through the barrier with an inexplicable gaze. Her eyes seemed to be able to pierce through the layers of dimensional barriers and directly see Luo Fan, who was in the 72 dimensional levels. To actually use such a method to break through my limit, I really can't underestimate anyone, the woman said indifferently. There seemed to be some joy and excitement in her expression. She looked like she didn't care that the prison had been broken through or that the six tribulation powerhouses in the prison had died. Faced with this situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. However, his body didn't move at all. Instead, his clone in the sea of nothingness began to move. In a flash, the clone arrived outside the barrier and arrived at the middle-aged woman's location. Or rather, it arrived at the place where it was directly facing the barrier. After arriving here, he casually grabbed forward and an indescribable power of nothingness appeared out of nowhere in his hand. It directly penetrated the barrier and surrounded the middle-aged woman. At this moment, the woman was suddenly startled. She turned around and saw Luo Fan's clone face to face. The moment their gazes met, she couldn't help but exclaim, "Who are you?" Even though she could see Luo Fan's projection hidden in the 72 dimensions, she hadn't noticed the existence of Luo Fan's clone at all. Although the middle-aged woman was hidden within everything on the island, she was currently projected onto the barrier. Clearly, there was a trace of her essence within the barrier. Although this trace of essence was insignificant compared to the middle-aged woman's entire body, it was still her essence. However, it was still her essence after all. If it was an ordinary cultivator, even if this essence was grasped, it wouldn't cause much of an impact. After all, no matter what, this middle-aged woman was still a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Her level wasn't something ordinary cultivators could compare to. But for Luo Fan, the significance of this essence was completely different. Luo Fan's level was much higher than that of the seventh generation powerhouse in front of him, let alone grasping a trace of the other party's essence. Just grasping a trace of the other party's aura was enough for him to accomplish something that ordinary cultivators couldn't even imagine. It could be said that the middle-aged woman had revealed a trace of her essence to Luo Fan, which meant that her weakness had fallen into Luo Fan's hands. The middle-aged woman had a clear understanding of this point. It was because of this clear understanding that she was so shocked at this moment. Once she recovered from her shock, she made a prompt decision. Boundless might erupted from her body in an instant, and as earth-shattering booms rang out, her projection started to distort. Chapter 3008. The middle-aged woman's choice at this moment was obviously to let the projection self-destruct. The self-destruction of the projection would not be a great loss to the woman. After all, no matter what, this was only a projection of the middle-aged woman. No matter how much of this woman's essence it contained, how much could it possibly contain? Such a small amount of essence damage was naturally not important to the woman. If it was lost, it was lost. However, if this essence fell into Luo Fan's hands, it would be equivalent to opening up her essence to Luo Fan. There were obviously too many things that Luo Fan could do with this essence. If he was not careful, he might lose control of his own life. Under such circumstances, there was no need to say much about what to choose. The middle-aged woman's choice was obviously the one that she should make. However, things were obviously not that simple. Since he had already set his target on this projection, or rather, this trace of essence, Luo Fan had naturally expected the other party's reaction. At this moment, when the projection's body began to wriggle and distort, he took action instantly. Space-time suddenly froze, and everything seemed to have been paused. The freezing of space-time directly affected the entire island, or rather, the entire prison. At this moment, everything on this island, including all living beings, had completely frozen and were unable to move at all. At this moment, there seemed to be an indescribable impact that was erupting, trying its best to break through all the restrictions and shackles that the body had suffered. However, it was a pity that compared to the space-time freezing technique that Luo Fan had comprehended with the help of the light of heaven and earth, the impact's essence was not much different. However, the carrier was still too weak. At this moment, no matter how hard the impact brewed and strengthened, it could only gradually dissipate inside the middle-aged woman's body in the end. Luo Fan waited for a while and could not help but sigh when he realized that there were no other changes. He casually grabbed the air, and the woman's body was directly pulled out of the barrier. Immediately afterward, the woman's body trembled and suddenly collapsed. A trace of indescribable subtle essence was left from the collapsed body and fell into the control of Luo Fan's incarnation. This essence was extremely subtle and complicated. There seemed to be an endless amount of principles and mysteries contained within. The strands of essence wriggled at this moment, as if they wanted to reform and take shape again, as if they wanted to regain control of the great power. Unfortunately, under Luo Fan's oppression, such a situation was obviously impossible. At this moment, Luo Fan's space-time stagnation on the prison below finally disappeared completely. The prison returned to its original appearance, but it lacked the vitality that had just appeared. The seven tribulation expert who had merged with everything in the world, that woman, had completely disappeared. Facing such a situation, the reincarnated bodies of the six tribulation experts seemed to have been revived. They were no longer in as much pain as before. On the contrary, they felt indescribably relaxed. It was as if the unbearable burden that had been pressing on them had been lifted off their shoulders. In fact, it was not wrong to think this way. The existence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse, even if it was just a trace of its essence, was obviously unimaginably heavy for a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Such an existence left in the bodies of the six tribulation experts would obviously suppress the existence of the six tribulation experts. Even if the six tribulation experts could not detect it due to the prison's confinement, this kind of suppression was unavoidable. It was precisely because of this existence that the six tribulation experts seemed so powerless against the prison's confinement. Normally speaking, no matter how strong the prison's confinement was, these six tribulation experts should have been able to find a way to break through the confinement after hundreds of millions of years. The reason why this situation did not happen was that the suppression of the seventh tribulation experts' essence on the sixth tribulation experts' essence was obviously one of the important reasons. Under such circumstances, at this time, the trace of the essence of a seventh tribulation expert was grasped by Luo Fan and no longer suppressed the existence of the experts. For them, this was not much different from a heavy burden being relieved. In addition to the impact caused by the impact of the prison's confinement principles by Luo Fan, many six tribulation experts in this prison began to have indescribable transformations. Extraordinary abilities began to emerge in many six tribulation experts and began to quickly sublimate, gradually turning into the way of cultivation, so that a wonderful cultivation civilization was born in this prison at an unimaginable speed. However, all of this was no longer within the scope of Luo Fan's concern. Now, what he cared about was the sliver of essence that belonged to a seventh tribulation expert in his hand. This trace of essence contained almost all the secrets of the seventh tribulation expert. This included her way of cultivation, her memory, her worldview, and all kinds of plans on the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. Let's see what secrets there are, Luo Fan murmured. His perception enveloped the trace of essence in front of him and began to penetrate into the essence. He wanted to dig out the secrets contained in the essence bit by bit. As a seventh tribulation expert, the complexity of the essence, even if it was just a trace, was already beyond the imagination of any living creature. If a sixth tribulation expert faced this trace of essence at this time, he might directly regard it as a vast and boundless group of heaven and earth. He might not be able to understand its true essence even if he explored it for hundreds of millions of years. As a seventh tribulation expert, Luo Fan was in existence at the peak of the seventh tribulation expert. Naturally, he would not be deceived by such a trace of essence. However, not being deceived did not mean that the secret in the essence was simple. In fact, he was not deceived only because of his own ability. The complexity of this trace of essence would not be weakened because of this. After Luo Fan's perception penetrated into the essence, the first thing he saw was endless light. It was a kind of pure and powerful light that faintly had the characteristics of a living creature. This kind of light was extremely similar to the light of heaven and earth. Of course, it was only similar. After all, there were still some essential differences between it and the light of heaven and earth. For example, the depth of this light was not comparable to the real light of heaven and earth. Although this light was very similar to the light of heaven and earth, it was not like the real light of heaven and earth. No matter how he looked at it, he could not detect its true essence. In particular, it felt like a living creature. This kind of light was far less intense than the light of heaven and earth. This is formed by the many mysteries extracted from the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan understood in his heart. Obviously, a sixth tribulation expert could already extract some divine sense, some abilities, and some dharma access from the light of heaven and earth. At the seventh tribulation expert, there was obviously a great improvement in this aspect. It was only natural that the various mysteries extracted could be condensed into this kind of light similar to the light of heaven and earth. Luo Fan had expected this kind of cultivation direction before, and he had even taken an important step in this direction. However, his previous expectations were just expectations. He had never seen this kind of cultivation from anyone else. This was the first time he truly understood the feasibility of this kind of cultivation direction. It could be said that just this small gain was already worth the time and energy he had previously wasted. Even if he did not gain anything from his exploration, he could already be considered to have returned from a rewarding journey. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly, but he didn't stop his exploration. Instead, he let his perception continue to penetrate deeper into the essence of the world. The light that was like the light of heaven and earth was endless. If he just used spatial movement to penetrate deeper, he might not be able to penetrate this light even if he spent billions of years. He would not be able to truly enter the essence of the light. Of course, this was not a problem for Luo Fan. For Luo Fan, he was too familiar with the light of heaven and earth. He was so familiar that he could even see the general structure of the light of heaven and earth of others at a glance. He could even see the inexplicable flaws in it. At this time, the surrounding light of heaven and earth was clearly the most perfect structure for a seventh tribulation expert. Not only did it have some of the characteristics of the light of heaven and earth, but it also contained some of the power of the light of heaven and earth. It was completely unable to escape its control. It was completely unlike the true light of heaven and earth. It was simply incomprehensible. The master was not like the master, but more like the servant of the light of heaven and earth. However, this was only for a seventh tribulation expert. If one were to look at this light from the perspective of the light of heaven and earth, then this light would be an extremely imperfect and broken light of heaven and earth. It did not even have the will of heaven and earth, nor did it have the level of heaven and earth. The characteristics that were like living things were very rare, and it was difficult to have the characteristics that surpassed the perception of ordinary cultivators. How could such a light of heaven and earth be considered a complete light of heaven and earth? Under such circumstances, Luo Fan could naturally see the countless loopholes and flaws in the light at a glance. Through these loopholes and flaws, he easily bypassed the light without causing any impact to it. He directly went through the light and crashed into the deeper essence behind it. Within the area protected by the light, there was an endless stream of information. This information was combined in an indescribable way to form a vast and boundless universe. In it, there were endless stars, endless living creatures, endless cultivators, and everything that could be found in a normal universe. However, all of this was combined and constructed in a way that Luo Fan could not recognize for a while. There were many things that were completely opposite of what Luo Fan knew. This situation obviously meant that this universe was constructed with a worldview that Luo Fan did not know or understand. A truly perfect worldview could naturally contain and explain everything. Even if the worldview was different, as long as it reached a perfect level, its performance would be extremely similar. After all, the worldview itself was born based on the chaotic state of the outside world. The purpose of its birth was to explain everything in the chaotic state, including the chaotic state itself, the predecessor of the chaotic state, and everything that would happen in the future. A perfect worldview would definitely be able to perfectly fit everything in the outside world. Therefore, no matter what direction this perfect worldview took and what was used to explain everything, it would definitely be able to justify itself in the end. The heaven and earth, the world, the space-time, the dimension, the universe, and even the chaotic state that was constructed with this worldview would definitely be the same as the real world. At least, it should be the same on the surface. However, this was only the performance that should occur when one's worldview reached a perfect level. One could imagine how difficult it was to push one's worldview to a perfect level. Luo Fan even suspected that the worldview of a true saint might not be considered truly perfect, Of course, an imperfect worldview would be different. It was like walking to the same destination from different roads. If one really reached the destination, the endpoint of the different roads would naturally be the same. However, on the way, the different roads would naturally not be in the same position. The direction it pointed to would also be different. At this time, the worldview of this universe and Luo Fan's worldview were two imperfect worldviews. Because they were both imperfect, even if the end point of these two worldviews was to explain the same chaotic state and the same kind of reality, the many aspects that they showed were different. Even though those completely contradictory concepts were a little exaggerated, it wasn't surprising for them to appear in such an imperfect worldview. At this moment, every time Luo Fan saw something, he could feel that there was endless information, principles, and concepts about that thing constantly pouring into his heart, causing a strong conflict with the original worldview that existed in his heart. It made him feel as if there was thunder and lightning constantly roaring in his heart. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3009. This essence was an extremely mysterious existence. In the past, Luo Fan had never come into contact with such a complete essence that belonged to a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Of course, this was related to the limited number of seventh tribulation powerhouses that he had come into contact with before. The higher a cultivator's cultivation, the more everything they cultivated would be integrated into their body. This was the same for an essence. An ordinary cultivator's essence was at most a bit of their life essence, which represented an existence similar to a true spirit. Although a person was extremely important to a cultivator, it was actually just that. For other cultivators, especially those who wanted to explore the secrets of that cultivator, there was nothing special about it. However, as a cultivator's cultivation became higher and higher, as they cultivated more and more deeply, as they gradually integrated their path of cultivation into their body, this essence would gradually begin to change. At a certain realm, this essence would gradually record everything about a cultivator. This included the mysteries of their cultivation, and even their worldview and memories. At the seventh tribulation powerhouse level, they had clearly reached the level where their essence would undergo such a change. Of course, even so, in reality, it was extremely difficult for an ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouse to truly seize another person's essence and directly imprison it to analyze and dissect it. If that was not the case, who would dare to so casually split out their projection and incarnation? Only someone like Luo Fan, who had already gone extremely far in the seventh tribulation realm and had even reached the peak of the seventh tribulation realm, could so easily come into contact with an essence that could be completely disintegrated with a single thought. Normally, an ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouse would not be able to move so quickly. After all, an essence was actually an existence that seemed illusory yet real. If one wanted to truly come into contact with it, they would first need to turn it into something real. Only then could they truly come into contact with it. Turning illusions into reality was a process that required a lot of time and energy. Normally, an ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouse would need to spend at least a billionth of an instant to do this. For the master of the seven tribulation expert, that was enough to completely destroy that bit of essence in his body. That was why it was so difficult to obtain the essence of other cultivators and easily analyze the essence of other cultivators. It required a great deal of strength to do so. Of course, all of this was naturally not a problem for the current Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's ability to freeze time and space had already become instinctive. He didn't even need to think about it. As long as he willed it, his body would naturally be able to take action first and completely freeze time and space. In this way, the owner of the essence naturally had no chance to destroy it. Of course, it was only at this moment that Luo Fan was able to turn the ability to freeze time and space into an instinctive ability. In the past, he was unable to do this. It could be said that this time, it was also a trial for him. Fortunately, this trial was obviously a success. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception continued to penetrate into the depths of the essence. The essence seemed to contain a vast and boundless universe, which was filled with an extremely strong worldview that belonged to the middle-aged woman. This worldview was so strong, and it was the absolute main body in this universe. It had an indescribable assimilation effect on all existences that entered this universe. Fortunately, Luo Fan had a firm and unique view of the world. His view of the world could always protect his mind, protect his ideas, and protect his self. Otherwise, even with his willpower, he would not be able to hold on for long before he would have to agree with the worldview that belonged to the middle-aged woman. It could be said that exploring the essence of other cultivators was not an easy task. It was not the kind of thing that came without risks. In particular, it was even more so when exploring the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. The existence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse could be said to have reached the final stage of cultivation below the true divine level. The difference between a seventh tribulation powerhouse and a true divine was only the difference of two major tribulations and one breakthrough. As long as one survived the eighth major tribulation, one would be an eighth tribulation powerhouse. As long as one survived the ninth major tribulation, one would be a ninth tribulation powerhouse. After that, one only needed to undergo some kind of transformation that Luo Fan could not understand at all. Naturally, one would be able to become a supreme, omnipotent, and indestructible true divine. Under such circumstances, although the worldview of a seventh tribulation powerhouse was far from complete, it was already at an unimaginable level for ordinary cultivators. It could be said that under normal circumstances, this worldview was enough to become the objective worldview of most cultivators below the tribulation realm. An objective worldview was a worldview that truly existed in a state of chaos. Or, to put it another way, it was a worldview that was manifested by true divine and used to open up the world. This worldview was already an absolutely perfect worldview for those below the true divine level. It could be regarded as the true appearance of the world, the true appearance of heaven and earth, and the true appearance of chaos. Naturally, such a worldview could also be called an objective worldview. For those below the tribulation realm, the worldview of a seventh tribulation powerhouse was equivalent to this worldview. For those below the tribulation realm, they would not even be able to see the difference between this worldview and the real world. They would not be able to see the difference between this worldview and the true divine worldview. In other words, they would not be able to see the imperfections of this worldview. It was precisely because of this that this worldview could be regarded as an objective worldview. It was self-evident how strong the assimilation effect of this worldview was. It could be said that if it was not for the same worldview protecting Luo Fan's mind and ideas, it would not take long for his mind to be completely assimilated after he sensed the essence of this worldview. In the end, his ideas would be completely distorted, and his entire thinking and his entire self would be completely changed. However, even if that was the case, even if he had his own unique worldview to protect his mind, his own thoughts, and his own ideas, Luo Fan still clearly felt the power of the unique worldview that belonged to the middle-aged woman. At this moment, he could feel his worldview trembling slightly at every moment, defending against some kind of indescribable invasion. At the same time, endless distorted memories were constantly injected into his heart through various methods, allowing him to grasp the true appearance of this universe bit by bit, as well as many details. The more powerful a cultivator was, the more memories that belonged to a cultivator would be contained in their essence. The cultivation of a cultivator itself was the process of implementing everything that one had comprehended into one's body. Memories were also the harvest of comprehension. The essence was also one of one's everything. Under such circumstances, implementing one's comprehension into one's body naturally included implementing one's memories into one's essence. However, it was obvious that this implementation was completely different from the implementation of ordinary memories. After all, this was just an essence, not a cultivator or a living being. Even if an essence was all-encompassing, contained endless mysteries, and could accommodate everything, it was still just an essence. As an essence, it could contain an endless world and a vast and boundless universe. But it couldn't really become the embodiment of the middle-aged woman, nor could it really accommodate the middle-aged woman's memories in a normal way. If that was really the case, then it wouldn't be an essence, but another middle-aged woman. Therefore, although this essence contained all of the middle-aged woman's mysteries, cultivation, and memories, all of this existed in a different way in this memory. The other method was none other than distortion, dispersal, mixing, and reconstruction. It could be said that everything that happened in this universe, and everything that was set up, was indeed part of the middle-aged woman's memories. However, these memories existed in an extremely chaotic manner in another way. It was as if everything that was happening on a certain planet was real, and some of the details were grasped from the middle-aged woman's memories. However, it was only an extremely small portion of it. Furthermore, it seemed to be right, yet it wasn't. It seemed very real and complete, but in reality, there were far too many things missing. Furthermore, it was extremely different from the real thing. In this case, under such circumstances, if he were to completely immerse himself in the memories and memorize all the details, he might not even be able to find the real memories of the middle-aged woman. What he would be able to sort out might just be a mishmash of memories. How wonderful! This is just the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. What about stronger existences? Luo Fan looked at the countless stars and the vast universe and could not help but sigh. At this moment, his perception had already covered the entire universe, including all the stars and living beings in this universe, and even the macroscopic structure of the universe itself. At this moment, he was able to absorb endless information from everything that his perception encompassed at every moment. At this moment, he could clearly sense that everything about the middle-aged woman was contained in everything that he had sensed. However, everything seemed to be shrouded in a layer of fog, and it was difficult to analyze it all. In essence, it was not a code. For cultivators, it was an instinctive action to carry out one's true nature. It was impossible for any cultivator to turn their essence into a mysterious password in order to guard against other cultivators. The essence of the middle-aged woman in front of him was the same. It could be said that everything in front of him was difficult for Luo Fan to understand. It made him feel as if he was looking at a heavenly book. This was not because the essence itself contained such mysteries, nor was it because the middle-aged woman had deliberately messed up everything and made everything turn into such a mixture. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because everything was constructed according to the unique worldview of the middle-aged woman. In Luo Fan's eyes, everything was so chaotic and incomprehensible. However, in the eyes of the middle-aged woman, perhaps everything was absolutely clear and could be understood at a glance. After thinking about it carefully, Luo Fan naturally understood the reason for all of this. The reason was that he seemed to be using his own worldview to explain everything. It was like two compression formats. For the middle-aged woman, she was using the compression format that she was most familiar with. This compression format had no secrets to her at all, and she did not even need to decompress it to be able to clearly see what the stability of the compression was talking about and what the many details were. However, Luo Fan was different. Luo Fan was using his own compression format. He was using his decompressor to compress more of the compressed files in the other compression format. In that case, what he would get would just be garbled code. In fact, for Luo Fan to be able to turn this essence into the shape of the universe, turning everything about the middle-aged woman into the shape of the endless stars, worlds, and creatures in the universe, it could be said that his ability was brilliant. He was able to turn a compressed file in another compression format into a readable file instead of a random code. Of course, there was an important reason for this. That was, although Luo Fan's worldview and the middle-aged woman's worldview seemed to be completely different, they were ultimately based on the same chaotic state. Even though there was a great difference in their appearances, there were still some similarities deep down in their true internal logic. These similarities were the fundamental reason why Luo Fan could turn the garbled code into this barely readable file. Of course, all of this was meaningless to the current Luo Fan. Genius 1 second remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3010. Although those memories existed in the many stars in the universe in an extremely distorted manner, for Luo Fan, it did not affect him much when it came to comprehending the mysteries of the middle-aged woman's cultivation. After all, what Luo Fan needed was not all of the middle-aged woman's memories. It would be a good thing if he could obtain those memories. However, if he could not obtain them, it would not affect him much. With a thought, Luo Fan divided his perception into billions of strands and sent them into the countless stars in the universe. He directly reincarnated into the ordinary life forms that existed in those stars and began to perceive everything in those stars from the perspective of an ordinary life form. This was not a simple matter. At the very least, it was not something that could be completed in a short period of time. It was extremely difficult for ordinary life forms to figure out the truth of the stars they were on and understand the mysteries of cultivation contained in them. Even the most talented geniuses would need years to achieve this. Therefore, it was clear that Luo Fan would have to maintain this posture for the next few years. At this moment, outside, Luo Fan's embodiment trembled slightly and came back to his senses. His perception was exploring the essence, so there was no need for his embodiment to always maintain its original posture. At this moment, the 72-level dimension had already left the prison. Outside the prison, it began to frantically absorb the endless void seawater from the outside world and continuously transform the void seawater into the dimension, causing each level of the dimension to expand continuously. The laws of each level of the dimension became more and more complicated during this process, and the space-time within it also became more and more stable. As for the vitality that filled it, it became even more intense. Originally, the first level of the dimension was only extremely close to the world. Now, after the endless void seawater poured in, it had truly become a complete world. Moreover, even though it had become a complete world, it did not stop the process of transformation. Instead, it continued to transform and become stronger and stronger in all aspects. Could it be that it wanted to transcend the shackles of the world and transform into a true world? Not only was the first layer experiencing such a change, but the other 71 layers were also undergoing similar changes at the same time. Below the 72 levels of dimensions, there were even layers of new dimensions that didn't require Luo Fan to construct. Layer after layer, the Yuan Fong finally revealed an indescribable feeling of perfection when it reached the 365th layer, stopping the evolution process. As new dimensions were constantly born, the stacked dimensions' absorption and devouring of the endless nothingness in the outside world became stronger. Gradually, a more and more obvious vortex formed around the layer of stacked dimension. This vortex affected the island that was acting as a prison below and gradually began to pull the island itself, causing the entire island to shake more and more intensely. As the island shook, the structure of the island began to shake. Starting from the edge of the island, more and more of the main body of the island began to collapse, turning into a smoke-like state that flowed along the vortex. In the end, it converged into the layer of stacked dimension in the center of the vortex, turning into nutrients for the layer of stacked dimension to further transform, making the layer of stacked dimension stronger and more perfect. At this moment, the incarnations of the many 6 tribulation powerhouses on the island discovered this change at the same time. At the same time, they also discovered that the shackles that originally prevented them from escaping the prison had completely disappeared. This prison had already become an ordinary island. After discovering this, the expressions of the many 6 tribulation powerhouses became inexplicably complicated. Some felt despair, some felt relief, some felt excitement, and some even felt indescribable resentment towards Luo Fan for causing all of this. The reason why there were such complicated expressions, and not all of them were elated, was very simple. It was because the 6 tribulation powerhouses here were only incarnations, clones, or projections of real six tribulation powerhouses. Previously, because of the special mechanism of the prison, their connection with their main bodies was cut off, and they unexpectedly gained independence and became independent individuals. But now, because the various mechanisms of the prison were broken, their independence naturally disappeared. This was because these clones, incarnations, or projections had different attitudes towards their own independence. At this time, this independent characteristic was broken, and their attitudes were naturally different. What a pity! Inexplicable sighs came from the mouths of the many sixth tribulation powerhouses. Immediately afterwards, rays of light flashed, and almost all the six tribulation powerhouses disappeared without a trace. They were all recalled by their main bodies. As these incarnations and clones were recalled, a sense of perception appeared out of nowhere in this area, giving Luo Fan a strong feeling that he was being spied on. This was clearly because the original bodies of the incarnations and clones had discovered this location after obtaining the memories of the incarnations and clones. At this time, it was their main bodies that were investigating the situation in this location. Oof. Luo Fan frowned and snorted coldly. An indescribable wave swept out from his body, instantly shattering the large amount of perception in the surroundings. This area instantly became a perception forbidden zone. Following this change, there was a wave of displeasure in the surroundings. Most six tribulation powerhouses had an indifferent attitude towards their perception being shattered, but there were simply too many six tribulation powerhouses spying on them. Among so many six tribulation powerhouses, it was impossible for all of them to have the same attitude after all. In the end, there would still be some six tribulation powerhouses who would transfer their depression and anger to Luo Fan. These waves of displeasure obviously came from the six tribulation powerhouses who had transferred their depression and anger to Luo Fan. Following these displeasure, Luo Fan's incarnation frowned slightly. This was because he suddenly saw a large number of six tribulation powerhouses heading towards where his incarnation was from all directions. The layer of the void ocean they were in was not in the same layer as the incarnation. At this time, they were approaching the incarnation, but it was as if they were shuttling between the pages of a book. The commotion was not small at all. If Luo Fan could only rely on that incarnation to sense everything at this time, he would definitely not be able to discover their arrival. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not only relying on that incarnation to sense these things at this time. He still had a deeper consciousness incarnation that was sensing everything. And in the eyes of this consciousness incarnation, those six tribulation powerhouses that were constantly breaking through the layer of the void ocean and approaching the incarnation were like ants shuttling between the pages of a book. He could clearly see their every move at a glance. Facing this situation, the eyes of Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation began to flicker slightly. The process of these six tribulation powerhouses shuttling through the layer of the void ocean revealed a kind of profoundness that he had never experienced before, the mysteries of the void ocean. There seems to be some kind of fixed method to locate the layer of the void ocean. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The process of these six tribulation powerhouses shuttling through the layer of the void ocean was extremely smooth. There were no bumps at all. It was as if they had done this countless times, and everything was carried out according to a fixed procedure. Luo Fan could not be more clear about what this meant. This clearly meant that this shuttling process had already been integrated into some kind of extremely perfect method. If that's the case, then I can understand why there are so many islands in this layer. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. If there was a perfect method to locate and shuttle through the layer of the void ocean, then according to that method, there would definitely be a layer of the void ocean that was the easiest to pass through and the easiest to locate. It was like adding. According to the principle of addition, no matter how big the number was, the result could be calculated according to the principle of addition. However, it was clear that there was a method of addition that was the easiest to obtain an answer. That was to add 0 to a certain number. It was clear that among all the methods of addition, adding 0 was the easiest to obtain an answer. It was the same for multiplication. It was also the same for division. Such a process could be extended to all calculations and deductions. It was the same for methods. Of course, compared to basic calculations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, the shuttling method used by the six tribulation powerhouses was clearly more complicated and mysterious. Among them, the layer of the void ocean that was the easiest to locate and pass through was also clearly more complicated. However, no matter how complicated it was, compared to the other layers of the nothingness ocean, the easiest layer could still be found. Clearly, the layer of the void ocean with many islands was very likely to be the layer of the void ocean where it was easiest for the technique to locate and pass through. With a thought, Luo Fan's consciousness directly descended on the location of the six tribulation powerhouses through his consciousness clone and enveloped them. Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation was in a place many levels deeper than those sixth tribulation experts. Under such circumstances, it was equivalent to looking down on those six tribulation powerhouses from a higher perspective by sending out his consciousness through this consciousness incarnation. It was clear that looking down from a higher angle was difficult for those existences at the bottom to detect. At this moment, none of those six tribulation powerhouses could detect Luo Fan's consciousness clone. They were only using their consciousness to lock onto the layer of the void ocean where Luo Fan's consciousness clone was located. Then, they used a method that allowed them to traverse the layer of the void ocean, continuously crossing layer after layer of the void ocean. During this process, they used that method almost to the limit. The profoundness of that method continuously leaked out and was sensed by Luo Fan's consciousness bit by bit. If it was just a six tribulation powerhouse traversing the void ocean, even if Luo Fan gained something, the amount would be limited. It was even more impossible to obtain such a technique. However, it was clear that the number of six tribulation powerhouses using that method to traverse the void ocean wasn't just one or two, but thousands and tens of thousands. When so many six tribulation powerhouses used the same method at the same time, even if one of them only revealed 1,000th or 10,000th of that method's profoundness, when added together, it was enough for Luo Fan to obtain all the profoundness of that method. At this moment, the profoundness revealed by those six tribulation powerhouses in the process of using that method was far more than 1,000th or 10,000th of that method's profoundness. Therefore, very soon, all the profoundness of that method was understood by Luo Fan. So that's the method. How wonderful! Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration as the many details of this method flowed through his mind. This method was quite extraordinary. It didn't feel like it was created by a six tribulation powerhouse. Instead, it seemed like it was created by a seventh tribulation powerhouse or above. In it, Luo Fan could clearly feel the perspective from a commanding position, as well as the profoundness that belonged to a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Among them, it used the profoundness of constructing dimensions extracted from the light of heaven and earth. It could even be said that the foundation of it was the profoundness of constructing dimensions. Using the light of heaven and earth to construct dimensions and decompose reality was a method that Luo Fan had only seen from seventh tribulation powerhouses. He had seen quite a few sixth tribulation experts, but none of them could do this. Perhaps this was because he didn't know much about six tribulation powerhouses. However, in Luo Fan's heart, he was more inclined to believe that this was not a method that six tribulation powerhouses could master. And this method of constructing dimensions was actually somewhat similar to the structure of the void ocean layer. If the layers in the void ocean layer were viewed from another perspective, wouldn't they be similar to those layers of dimensions? The profoundness of that method flowed bit by bit in Luo Fan's mind. Eventually, it gradually integrated and formed a complete method. There was bound to be a huge difference between this technique and the techniques mastered by many six tribulation powerhouses. It could even be said that the only thing similar between the two was the profoundness behind them. If a cultivator who could not see through the essence of these two techniques saw these two techniques, they might think that they were completely different techniques. It could be said that this method was most suitable for Luo Fan. It was a method created based on the principle of traversing through the void ocean layer. It might not necessarily be more refined than the methods mastered by 6 tribulation powerhouses, but in the hands of Luo Fan, it was definitely more efficient than the methods mastered by 6 tribulation powerhouses. Chapter 3011. In fact, rather than saying that this technique was a technique that 6 tribulation powerhouses used to cross the void ocean, it was more accurate to say that it was a technique that Luo Fan had created based on their principles of crossing. After this technique was created, the eyes of Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation flashed, and hundreds of layers suddenly appeared in the void ocean layer. In the blink of an eye, the desolate void ocean became extraordinarily lively. Countless islands, cave abodes, and dojos that couldn't be seen before appeared in front of him. Just like how a certain calculation method had the easiest method to obtain an answer, any technique was the same. The void ocean layer that Luo Fan's incarnation was in had the most islands and cultivators. Clearly, this was the void ocean layer that was the easiest to reach with this technique. Just like multiplication, if you multiplied a number by 0, the result would always be 0. This was clearly the easiest answer for multiplication. However, this didn't mean that there was no easy answer for multiplication. If you multiplied a number by 1, the result would be the same number. Clearly, this wasn't difficult to see. Multiplication was the same, addition was the same, and division was the same. The same was true for the shuttling technique that Luo Fan had created. Apart from a nothingness ocean layer where his incarnation was, there were also many layers of the nothingness ocean that were relatively easy to reach. The easier it was to reach the void ocean layer, the more 6 tribulation powerhouses would choose to stay there. In this way, the layers of the nothingness ocean would accumulate and gradually become thicker as time passed. This was the void ocean layer that Luo Fan's incarnation was currently seeing. With Luo Fan's ability, after mastering this technique, he could naturally see the void ocean layers that were relatively easy to reach. In fact, this was not the end. As time passed, and he became more and more familiar with this technique, he would be able to see more and more layers of the ocean of nothingness. Looks like most of the cultivators here have made the same choice as me. Observing the extraordinarily lively ocean of nothingness, Luo Fan could not stop himself from feeling emotional. Evidently, the number of cultivators in the void ocean far exceeded his imagination. This situation meant that many of the cultivators on the 6th level of the Down Master's Road were obviously like Luo Fan. They also regarded the surrounding nothingness ocean as the focus of their exploration, a focus that was not inferior to the exploration of their own heavens. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan refocused his attention on the clone. This was because the first 6 tribulation expert from another layer of the void ocean had already crossed the barriers between layers of the void ocean and reached this layer, appearing in front of Luo Fan's clone. It was a middle-aged man. This middle-aged man's body was surrounded by a dark brilliance, like a black hole, as if it was constantly swallowing everything in the outside world. He was only in clone, but Luo Fan could clearly feel a strong sense of curiosity from him. After the middle-aged man appeared, he said to Luo Fan indifferently, "Do you know that you've made a big mistake?" Luo Fan smiled and said, "Do you know what I've done wrong? You've made a mistake by destroying this prison," the middle-aged man said with a smile. At this moment, the prison below had completely collapsed and was completely injected into the 365 levels below Luo Fan, or in other words, the 365 levels of the world. So you know about the existence of this prison. Your clones are looking forward to merging with you. Luo Fan smiled faintly. The middle-aged man's expression stiffened slightly. Luo Fan's words simply reopened his scars. After all, they had already regained the memories of their clones in the prison. They were very clear about the mentality, expectations, and desires of their clones. However, they clearly knew about the existence of the prison and clearly had the ability to save their clones, but they just sat and watched as their clones were imprisoned and tortured. This kind of method was very chilling. Even though this method was used against their own clones, it was still the same. The middle-aged man shook his head and said with a strange expression, "That's also us." At most, we can only be considered to be self-torture. Self-torture? That's a reasonable explanation. Luo Fan still smiled faintly. He didn't care too much about the middle-aged man's mentality. He only said that to slightly provoke the middle-aged man. At this moment, 6 tribulation powerhouses appeared here one after another. These 6 tribulation powerhouses looked at the prison that had already disappeared with shock on their faces. Evidently, they were extremely shocked that Luo Fan could actually destroy this prison. Fellow Taoist, do you know that you've already made a big mistake? An old man said with a sigh. Luo Fan looked at these 6 tribulation powerhouses and suddenly felt a little bored. He originally thought that these 6 tribulation powerhouses didn't come to save their clones because they didn't know that their clones were imprisoned. He didn't expect that this was the truth. These 6 tribulation powerhouses actually sat and watched their clones being imprisoned and tortured because they were afraid of the owner of the prison. Their choice was understandable, but Luo Fan didn't like it at all. He originally had the idea of learning some of the mysteries of the 6th level of the Town Master's Road from these cultivators. But now he had no such desire at all. They really made him a little nauseous. Go, and don't appear in front of me again. Luo Fan shook his head and waved his hand. An indescribable wave was released from his hand, and in the blink of an eye, it swept through the bodies of the surrounding cultivators. In the blink of an eye, the bodies of these 6 tribulation powerhouses instantly disintegrated and completely turned into powder and dust. They directly melted into the surrounding nothingness ocean and disappeared without a trace. This wasn't the end of the fluctuation. In the process, it continued to penetrate into the depths of the nothingness ocean, affecting other layers of the nothingness ocean and crushing and erasing the bodies of the 6 tribulation powerhouses who were constantly rushing over. In the blink of an eye, all the 6 tribulation powerhouses who were heading towards the location of Luo Fan's clones had disappeared without a trace. The whole process was so straightforward that it didn't even attract the attention of other cultivators who were not involved. For a moment, the whole nothingness ocean seemed to be quiet. Many of the 6 tribulation powerhouses kept quiet out of fear. Although it was only their incarnations and clones that were erased, their incarnations and clones were still existences at the level of 6 tribulation experts. Any one of them in the 5th level of the Town Master's Road was definitely a terrifying existence that could absolutely suppress 80% or even 90% of the cultivators there. If they were in a group of worlds, they could even completely erase the whole group of worlds with a single thought. One could imagine how powerful such an existence was. But at this time, so many of them, so many incarnations and clones, were wiped out by Luo Fan without any ability to resist at all. During the whole process, they didn't feel a trace of abnormality at all. They didn't find any way that Luo Fan attacked them. They just felt that their clones and incarnations were intact one moment and completely erased the next. This unknown made them truly feel how weak they were. They were willing to give up their clones and incarnations in the face of the great calamity prison built by a 7 tribulation powerhouse. Now that they were facing Luo Fan, who was at least a 7 tribulation powerhouse, or even an 8 tribulation powerhouse, how could they have the courage to fight against Luo Fan? Luo Fan's clone waited for a while and found that there was no one around to spy on him. He couldn't help but show an even more disappointed look on his face. They really don't dare to resist at all. At this moment, he finally completely gave up on these 6 tribulation powerhouses. With a slight thought, he focused his attention on the many layers of the void ocean. According to Luo Fan's understanding, the void ocean was actually like the state of chaos, which was also divided into countless layers. Every layer of the nothingness ocean was similar to the chaos layer in the state of primal chaos. Of course, this was ultimately not the state of chaos, nor was it a simulated state of chaos. The void ocean layer and the chaotic layer were ultimately fundamentally different. For example, in the true chaotic layer, there was no difference in depth between different chaotic layers. Different chaotic layers were only caused by differences in understanding. However, There was no such thing as a deeper chaotic layer overlooking a shallow chaotic layer. It could even be said that the true chaotic layer could not distinguish the difference in depth between the real chaotic layer and the shallow layer. The nothingness ocean layer was no longer the same. There was an extremely obvious difference in depth between the void ocean layer and the shallow layer. Moreover, the difference between the deep and shallow layers was so huge that it was beyond any living creature's imagination. The deep layer was almost definitely above the shallow layer. No matter which aspect it was, the shallow void ocean layer had no ability to resist compared to the deep void ocean layer. Under such circumstances, if a cultivator really wanted to explore the nothingness ocean, they would naturally go as deep as they could. Of course, this was only exploration. If there were other purposes, it would naturally be different. For example, a person could jump 1 to 2 meters high. However, he would only jump with all his might when it was necessary. Normally, it was impossible for him to dance like this all the time. It was the same for cultivators. When they explored, they could go as deep as possible into the void ocean layer and explore as much as possible. However, that was only when they were exploring. Normally, when they were cultivating, communicating with other cultivators, trading with other cultivators, or carrying out certain cultivation missions, they would naturally choose a more convenient place to go. That was the source of the lively layers of the void ocean. It was also the source of the islands. From the source of the lively void ocean layer and the islands, it could be seen that there were not many cultivators who stayed on the islands for a long time. Most cultivators only treated the islands as temporary stops. Perhaps they would come to an island after exploring for a period of time, but they only treated it as a transit point. As a result, the number of cultivators on each of the islands was enormous. This huge number of cultivators increased the liveliness of the void ocean layer, causing the originally empty void ocean layer to look like a surging tide of people. This scene was not seen by Luo Fan at the beginning. Instead, as Luo Fan became more familiar with the void ocean layer, it gradually revealed itself to him. Although the void ocean layer was fundamentally different from the chaos layer, since there were similarities, there were naturally similarities. The biggest similarity between them was that one's knowledge determined one's visibility of a certain level. For example, Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation could be said to be in the depths of the void ocean layer. According to the principle that the deeper layer was above the shallower layer, and the deeper layer could see above the shallower layer, the mind incarnation should be able to see everything that it could see with a single glance. It should even be able to see more scenes in the shallower layer that it could not see yet. However, it was only until now that he had become extremely familiar with the void traversal technique and recognized the existence of the layers of the void sea, that he could clearly see the existence of the layers of the void sea. He could see the many islands and cultivators that existed within the layers of the void sea or between the layers of the void sea. This was because he had some understanding of the existence of the countless layers of the sea of nothingness. Because in his heart, the layers of the void didn't exist. Therefore, in his eyes, the layers of the void didn't exist either. Even though the void ocean layer was actually already under his nose, and some cultivators in the void ocean layer had already passed through where he was, it was still the same. This quality, which was closely related to knowledge, was clearly very similar to the characteristics of the chaos layer. It was clearly a similar situation for the chaos layer. If you know of the existence of a certain chaotic state layer, then to you, that chaotic state layer exists. Chapter 30:12. With a thought, Luo Fan continued to deepen the technique. This technique could allow one to travel between many layers of the void ocean. This also meant that one could recognize the existence of countless layers of the void ocean through this technique. As long as one recognized the characteristics of the void ocean, one would naturally be able to see its existence. Therefore, if one wanted to see the entire nothingness ocean layer clearly, the most convenient place to start was, of course, this technique. This technique was created by Luo Fan himself based on the traveling methods of many six tribulation powerhouses. It was a technique that was most suitable for him. This was the most suitable technique for him, so it was naturally extremely easy for him to deepen it. Very soon, layers of the void ocean appeared in front of his eyes as he deepened the technique. Based on the relationship between the many layers of the void ocean, the deeper one went, the harder it was to reach the void ocean. This was the case even though the technique created by Luo Fan was not difficult. Therefore, even though it was not difficult for Luo Fan to deepen the technique, it was extremely difficult for him to truly push his understanding to the deepest layer of the void ocean. After spending a few days, Luo Fan had only deepened the technique to the layer of the void ocean where his consciousness incarnation was. At this point, a feeling of powerlessness emerged from the bottom of his heart. It made him feel as if all of his inspiration had been exhausted, and his understanding of that technique seemed to have reached its limit. Luo Fan had already expected this situation, but he did not feel discouraged because of it. In reality, the difficulty of his understanding of this technique at this moment was the true difficulty of this technique. It was like trying to find an ant nest in an unknown location in a forest with the help of one's feet. Without a map, the difficulty was self-evident. The void ocean layer was like an ant's nest in a forest. The boundless ocean of nothingness was a vast and boundless forest. Obviously, because Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation overlooked the shallower layer of the void ocean, it was equivalent to grasping the specific map of the forest. He clearly knew where the ant nests could be and which areas were suitable for building ant nests. Under such circumstances, it was naturally a relatively easy task to find the ant nests. Now, facing the deeper layer of the void ocean, he seemed to have explored an area beyond the scope of the map. He was at a loss as to where the ant nests could be and where the ant nests were suitable for building ant nests. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to find the ant nests, he could only explore bit by bit. He had to walk through every inch of the forest step by step to find the ant nests if he was lucky. Luo Fan, who had already expected this increase in difficulty, immediately thought about it. He began to deepen the method bit by bit, and with great difficulty, he found a deeper layer of the ocean of nothingness in the midst of the confusion. In other words, he was using this technique to prove the existence of the deeper layer of the void ocean. For the void ocean, as long as one recognized the existence of a certain layer of the void ocean, one would naturally be able to see its appearance. That was why Luo Fan was able to see so many layers of the ocean of nothingness that he couldn't see before by just relying on the deepening of this technique. Finding the location of a new layer of the void ocean amidst the confusion was like groping in the darkness. Even if this technique was created by Luo Fan, it was still extremely difficult for him to achieve his goal. It was foreseeable that this would definitely be an extremely long process. At this moment, Luo Fan did not focus all his attention on this. At Luo Fan's level, he had long been able to divide his mind at will. Dividing a part of his mind to carry out a type of research did not hinder him from carrying out another type of research. This was not difficult to understand. If one did not have the ability to divide one's mind, how could techniques such as clones and incarnations appear? If methods such as clones and incarnations could not think independently and could only share a part of the main body's mind, then what was the point of such methods? At this moment, Luo Fan divided the part of his mind that was deepening the technique and let this part of his mind continue to deepen the technique and search for a deeper layer of the void ocean. The rest of his mind began to sense the situation of the many layers of the void ocean that he had discovered. Among the many layers of the void ocean, there were cultivators in almost every layer. However, the difference in numbers was quite large. The layers with the most cultivators were like the layer where Luo Fan's incarnation was at. There might be hundreds of millions of cultivators there. There might only be 2 or 3 cultivators at the very least. These many cultivators behaved differently in the various layers of the void ocean, but most of them were exploring the mysteries of the void ocean. Of course, although the number of cultivators was not fixed, the distribution of the cultivators still followed a certain pattern. This pattern was that other than the layer of the void ocean that Luo Fan's incarnation was at, the deeper the layer of the void ocean, the fewer cultivators there were. At the same time, the stronger the cultivators were. Luo Fan's incarnation even discovered that in the 2 layers of the void ocean above the incarnation, there were cultivators who were close to the 7th tribulation exploring. As for what they were exploring, there was no need to explain. Every layer of the Nihility Sea was different. Although it was within the Nihility Sea, its complexity far exceeded one's imagination. Most of the complexity was related to space-time, laws, and the like. However, some of the complexity was manifested in the form of matter and energy. If the complexity was related to space-time, laws, and the like, then the void ocean would look like nothingness at first glance. This was quite consistent with the void ocean that Luli knew. However, if the complexity was related to matter and energy, then the void ocean was clearly different. There were all kinds of strange things in such a void ocean. There were islands, continents, spaces, worlds, and even heaven and earth. Almost as long as one wanted to find it, they could find it. As for those cultivators, they were exploring the many complicated areas. All of them would occasionally display some sort of harvest. Just like at this moment, when Luo Fan was observing, there was a cultivator in the layer of the void 2 layers above his consciousness incarnation that suddenly comprehended something. His body flickered and faintly resonated with a certain part of the void in the distant sea of nothingness. His entire body turned into a stream of light and brazenly broke through the layer of the sea of nothingness and fell into a deeper layer, which was the layer of the sea of nothingness that was only 1 layer away from Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation. As he charged into the ocean of nothingness, the light that resonated with the cultivator in the distance continued to flash. Shortly after, an indescribable aura of transcendence appeared above the heavens, as if it was about to ascend with the heavens. With one look, it was clear that he had gained a lot, reflecting his comprehension to the sky. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan came to a realization. The layer of nothingness above the mental incarnation was a rare layer of nothingness that contained the complexity of matter and energy. Because of this, it did not appear to be empty. Instead, it seemed to be filled with countless substances. These matters formed a world that seemed both real and illusory. Everything in that world existed in a way that seemed both real and illusory. Of course, the entire void ocean layer was huge, and this illusory world was boundlessly vast, almost covering the entire void ocean layer. If one were to calculate it in terms of surface area, it would probably be billions of light years wide. At this moment, the cultivator fell into this world. This cultivator's cultivation realm had reached the peak of the 6th tribulation, only a step away from the 7th tribulation. If he had walked in the opposite direction, there was a high chance that he would have already triggered his 7th tribulation. However, it was obvious that this cultivator had taken the orthodox path of cultivation in the Tao Master Great World, which is also the right path. There were no tribulations on this kind of right path. Therefore, even if he had reached this step, he was still extremely far away from breaking through and becoming a true 7th tribulation expert. At the very least, it would take an extremely long time to accumulate the foundation to be able to break through this gap one day. Even if he was unlucky, he might never be able to break through this gap. Compared to the reverse path, the right path did not have any tribulations and seemed to be much safer. However, it was obvious that this safety was not without a price. The price of this safety was that the cultivator who took the right path had to spend countless times more energy and time to achieve the same growth rate as the one who took the reverse path. At this moment, the cultivator seemed to have sensed something. He suddenly stood still and said loudly, "I wonder which cultivator is joking with me. Can you come out and meet me?" Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. With a slight jolt in his heart, he already understood that the other party's words were directed at him. He can actually sense my spying. Is it because he broke through the layer of nothingness? This thought emerged in his mind. As long as a cultivator had a little bit of cultivation, they could clearly sense whether others were talking to them or not, let alone an incredible existence like Luo Fan. At this moment, although the other party's words did not point to anything, Luo Fan was extremely sure that the other party was talking to him. The cultivator looked like a young man. He was not too handsome, but he was not ugly either. At most, he could only be considered ordinary. However, his eyes were extremely bright and deep. The wisdom contained in them was as deep as the ocean, giving people a good impression of him. At least, at this moment, Luo Fan did not have any feelings of disdain or disgust toward him. Since he did not have such feelings, he did not reject having a conversation with the other party. At this moment, with a thought, an incarnation leaped out from his mind incarnation. It was a technique that he created to pass through the nothingness layer. His figure had already leaped into the nothingness layer and appeared directly in front of the young man. As soon as the young man saw Luo Fan's figure, his expression changed slightly. He said, "It turns out that fellow Taoist has explored the deeper layer. My apologies, my apologies." When Luo Fan heard this, he knew that the young man had probably paid attention to what his incarnation had done outside the prison. "I didn't notice your perception. Fellow Taoist, your means are really brilliant. No wonder you're a disciple of the Tao Master." Luo Fan just smiled slightly. Earlier, when he was peeking at a deeper level, he was unable to tell. But now that he was face to face with this young cultivator, he was completely certain that this young cultivator was definitely a disciple of a Tao Master. His strength was much greater than that of ordinary loose cultivators, and his methods were also much more brilliant. It's just some small tricks. On the contrary, it's more admirable that you can step into the deeper layer in such a short time. The young man just sighed, and there was a hint of envy in his eyes. Compared to the rogue cultivators that Luo Fan had met before, the disciple of the Tao Master in front of him was calmer and more confident. Even at this time, Luo Fan seemed to be standing in a higher position than him, but he did not feel inferior at all. Obviously, he did not think that he was much worse than Luo Fan. Compared with the previous few layers, the conflict between the disciples of the Tao Master and the rogue cultivators did not seem to be so serious in the sixth layer of the path of the Tao Master. The disciple of the Tao Master in front of him did not change his attitude towards Luo Fan at all because he was a rogue cultivator. He behaved as if he was facing a very ordinary cultivator. There was no arrogance, no humility, just an ordinary treatment. It was rare for Luo Fan to meet a disciple of the Tao Master who had no conflicts of interest and could communicate well with him. At this time, he naturally would not let go of the opportunity to communicate with the other party. However, he did not force any memories or mysteries from the other party like he did with other cultivators. Instead, he just communicated with the other party in words. After some introductions, the two of them were considered to be acquainted with each other. After that, the two of them casually opened up a cave residence in the already extremely deep layer of the nothingness ocean, and then began to sit down and discuss Tao. The disciple of the young Tao Master was called Taoist Hongqua, and he was an ordinary disciple of the Tao Master in the sixth layer of the path of the Tao Master. It could be said that there was no other connection between him and the sixth senior brother, except that they were both disciples of the Tao Master. Through the conversation with Taoist Hongqua, Luo Fan felt that his understanding of the sixth layer of the path of the Tao Master was constantly deepening, and many of his original speculations were overturned in the process. Chapter 30:13. There was no doubt that the focus of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was the all heavens formed by the light of heaven and earth. However, the method of cultivating the all heavens was completely different from what Luo Fan had thought before. Luo Fan had thought that the Tao Master's path was aimed at cultivating the all heavens. Through various means, such as exploration, one could enhance one's understanding and mastery of the all heavens. Obviously, this was not the case. The sixth level of the Tao Master's path was aimed at cultivating the all heavens. It did not start from the all heavens, but from the surrounding endless nothingness ocean. Many experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path believe that all the mysteries of the all heavens were hidden in the surrounding endless nothingness ocean. The all heavens were like some kind of mysterious thing that living beings could not understand at all, and the surrounding endless nothingness ocean was like a translator. Directly exploring and studying the all heavens was like directly studying a completely incomprehensible heavenly book. Obviously, this kind of research method would definitely yield half the results with twice the effort. On the contrary, the research target was the translator. Although it was not easy to find the translated content in the endless nothingness ocean, what they found was something that they could understand and completely understand in an instant. One was placed in front of them, but they could not understand it no matter how hard they tried. The other was scattered, but they could instantly understand it as long as they found it. For the six tribulation experts, there was no need to say much about which choice to make. Therefore, although the Tao Master's path was aimed at cultivating the all heavens, the cultivators on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path focused on the surrounding endless nothingness ocean. Through Taoist Hong Qua's explanation, Luo Fan looked at the positions of the six tribulation experts in the layers of the nothingness ocean and made a new discovery. The six tribulation experts seemed to appear randomly in the layers of the nothingness ocean, but in fact, from a certain point of view, their positions were actually quite close to the corresponding all heavens. It was just that the heavens were not in any of the layers of the void ocean, but in the entirety of the void ocean. In other words, they were outside the layers of the void ocean. That was why they did not seem to be close to their corresponding heavens. With a thought, the ocean of nothingness that had been separated into countless layers in Luo Fan's eyes began to merge back into one. The bustling scene gradually faded away, leaving only the heavens and the sea of nothingness, as well as the positions of the six tribulation experts that he had deliberately left behind. As his perspective changed, the countless six tribulation experts, who seemed to have been scattered across the entire void ocean, seemed to have been tied up by invisible ropes around the heavens. Although at first glance, it seemed that the heavens that resonated with their auras were quite far away. As long as one looked carefully, they would discover that the heavens that resonated with their auras were shining at all times. If one were to look at it from a macro perspective, the distance between them was actually almost constant. In other words, the movements of the cultivators seemed to be random and constantly changing. But in reality, from the perspective of the entire sea of nothingness as a whole, they were just circling around their own all heavens. I see. How wonderful. After recognizing this, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim inwardly. To be able to turn this kind of circling into an infinite and free trajectory, that the cultivators could not see any position restrictions, one could imagine how mysterious the sea of nothingness was. At this moment, Luo Fan's understanding of the sea of nothingness deepened. It had almost become Luo Fan's instinct to explain things that he could not understand. Therefore, at this moment, his heart was slightly moved, and he began to guess why this situation would happen. Why was it that from a macroscopic perspective, these cultivators seemed to be circling around their own all heavens, but when they were separated and projected into the countless layers of the sea of nothingness, they seemed to be able to walk freely in the entire sea of nothingness? Luo Fan's knowledge was extraordinary, and he had some basic understanding of the characteristics of the sea of nothingness. With a slight thought, he quickly came up with a possible explanation. The fundamental reason might be because of the different proportions of the many layers of the sea of nothingness. The deeper one was the farther the distance would be when projected into the shallow layer. For example, now his incarnation had walked countless light years, but it was only equivalent to a small step for his consciousness incarnation. His consciousness incarnation was actually not at the deepest layer of the sea of nothingness. There was clearly a deeper layer of the sea of nothingness beneath the consciousness incarnation. As for the deeper layer of the sea of nothingness, perhaps even if Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation walked for hundreds of millions of light years, it would not be comparable to a small step by the other party. This difference was obviously a manifestation of the huge difference in the spatial proportions between different layers of the sea of nothingness. This difference did not seem to be fixed, and it seemed to be closely related to the cultivator's own understanding. In the understanding of the cultivator, the greater the difference between the layers of the sea of nothingness, the greater the spatial proportions would be. In other words, if one's understanding was that there was a difference between the two layers of the sea of nothingness, then the spatial proportions might only be maintained at a certain stage. However, if one's understanding was that there was more than a difference of a layer between the two layers of the sea of nothingness, then the spatial proportions might only be at a certain stage. And this characteristic meant that the corresponding spatial positions between different layers of the sea of nothingness were not one-to-one. In other words, a point in the deep layer did not correspond to a point in the shallow layer. Instead, a point in the deep layer might correspond to a large area in the shallow layer. For example, Luo Fan's consciousness incarnation was in the layer where the consciousness incarnation was located, and the consciousness incarnation only corresponded to a small area of space where it was located. However, at a shallower level, the corresponding area might be billions of quadrillion light years in radius. Moreover, if the number of layers of the sea of nothingness was different in his understanding, the area of the area would probably change greatly. It might become wider or narrower. Obviously, this change in distance would cause the corresponding areas of the sea of nothingness between different cultivators to overlap. This was not difficult to understand. In the eyes of a certain cultivator, the location of the island in the sea of nothingness was trillions of light years away, but in the eyes of another cultivator, this distance was only a few dozen kilometers. Moreover, both were true and correct for each other. In this way, the powerhouse who knew that the island was only a few dozen kilometers away from him was also enveloped by the macroscopic region of the cultivator who thought that the island was trillions of light years away from him. In other words, the positions of the two had overlapped in that layer of the void ocean. Of course, trillions of light years and a few dozen kilometers were extremely extreme changes. Ordinary six tribulation powerhouses' understanding of the sea of nothingness naturally would not have such a huge difference. However, different cultivators' understanding of cultivation and the sea of nothingness was different. Therefore, the width of each layer of the sea of nothingness and the distance between each island and their bodies, or in other words, between their understanding and their own heavens, was different. In this way, it was inevitable that the corresponding regions would overlap. The existence of the overlaps naturally allowed them to freely travel between the various layers of the sea of nothingness, even if their macroscopic overall position did not change. They could go to any place they wanted to go without being bound. Of course, this overlap was ultimately due to the cognition of many cultivators. Naturally, it only affected their positions among the various layers of the sea of nothingness. It naturally did not affect the heavens that were above the many layers of the sea of nothingness. Therefore, the positions between the many heavens would not change because of this. This made it difficult for many cultivators to cross the distance between the heavens and visit each other's heavens at all. This was the case even if the contradiction in their cognition made one heaven seem to be enveloped by the position of another heaven. I see. I didn't expect the cultivation method to be like this. It's really very ingenious. Luo Fan praised. Taoist Hong Kuo smiled slightly. This was set up by many Tao masters. How can it not be ingenious? As a disciple of a Tao master, Taoist Hong Kuo was clearly more confident than an itinerant cultivator. At this time, he was leisurely and calm as he talked about the world. I previously received information from the Sea of Nothingness that there will be a war. I wonder what kind of war it is? Luo Fan continued to praise and asked, War? When Taoist Hong Kuo heard Luo Fan ask about the war, he could not help but show an indescribable expression. He seemed to be sighing, a little fearful, and even more expectant. It was unimaginably complicated. After a while, he said, Since you've entered the sea of nothingness, you must have obtained some information. How much do you know? I only know that this war seems to be a fight with other great heavens for the land of opportunity. Luo Fan only said. That was about all he knew. As for how the war would be carried out, where it would break out, how the final outcome would be determined, how the land of opportunity would be distributed, the consequences of failure, the consequences of not participating, and so on and so forth. He was not clear about any of that. Taoist Hong Kuo was slightly stunned. Then, he said with admiration, "What you know is already the core key. Apart from that, everything else was just minor details. I didn't expect you to understand such a key point so soon after you stepped into this level. It's really admirable." Luo Fan only smiled bitterly. "You must be joking. You say it's the key, but isn't it just a guess? I hope you won't be stingy with your guidance." Taoist Hong Kuo only praised. Of course, he did not keep Luo Fan in suspense. Since Luo Fan wanted to know, he was not stingy and explained in detail to Luo Fan. As he explained, Luo Fan understood more about the war. This war was going to be carried out in a rather complicated manner. The enemies of the war were not fixed. Sometimes it would be one great world, and sometimes it would be many great worlds. Usually, the path of the true sage, which was also the path of the Tao Master, was the target of the battle. When the war broke out, the cultivators who participated in the war would be taken to a certain land of opportunity to fight for the hub of the land of opportunity. The winner would control the hub, while the loser would leave behind a large number of corpses to become nutrients for the land of opportunity, allowing the land of opportunity to grow. After that, the winner would return, and every cultivator who participated in the war would be given the key to enter the land of opportunity. After that, it would naturally be the next war, the next battle. However, it was clear that the next war would not break out at will. Normally, after a war, one would have a certain amount of choice to choose when the next war would break out and which land of opportunity to be absorbed into. In other words, one would have to fight over which land of opportunity. Of course, this choice was not unlimited. The choice was not fixed. Usually, it was the cultivator who had made the greatest contribution in the last war. For a long time, in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, the choice would change within a certain range. Sometimes it would be the disciples of the Tao Master, and sometimes it would be the experts among the rogue cultivators. If it was the disciples of the Tao Master, it would usually be between the 6th senior brother and a few other experts whose strength was close to the 6th senior brother. However, if the choice was in the hands of the rogue cultivators, the situation would be different. If the choice was in the hands of the rogue cultivators, the range of their authority would be more than 10 times larger than that of the disciples of the Tao Master. Obviously, this kind of authority was quite powerful. If the existence with this kind of authority wanted to mess with their enemies, there were too many ways to do so. At the very beginning, the hatred between the itinerant cultivators and the Tao Master's disciples had caused both sides to constantly set each other up. When the authority fell into the hands of the Tao Master's disciples, the Tao Master's disciples would constantly choose places of opportunity that were disadvantageous to the itinerant cultivators, and the time of the war that was disadvantageous to the itinerant cultivators. Similarly, when the rogue cultivators had this authority, they would also choose the land of opportunity and the time of the war that was disadvantageous to the disciples of the Tao Master. During this period of time, both sides suffered heavy casualties. In the war, they were also repeatedly defeated, causing the 6th level of the Tao Master's path to suffer great losses. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3014. After all, the 6 tribulation experts were extraordinary. After a few times, they naturally understood that it was impossible to continue like this. Therefore, after a few times, the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators finally reached an understanding. At least in the war, they would no longer target each other. Sure enough, with this understanding, they finally regained their foothold in the battle with the other great heavens. They were no longer retreating as they had been before and began to win and lose. And this understanding in the war, as time passed, naturally gradually affected other times. The so-called 3 great metals among mortals was also effective at the level of the 6 tribulation experts. Having carried a spear together was one of the 3 great metals. The cooperation between the independent cultivators and the Tao Master's disciples in the war naturally eased the relationship between them. The independent cultivators, because of their cooperation in the war, saw the advantages of the Tao Master's disciples and no longer hated them as much. And the Tao Master's disciples also saw the advantages of the independent cultivators in the cooperation. So their disdain and hatred for the independent cultivators was naturally not as strong. In this way, after one war after another, the relationship between the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path began to gradually ease. Now, after hundreds of millions of years, the relationship between the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path had become what it was today. Almost no cultivator would distinguish between the independent cultivators and the Tao Master's disciples as clearly as they did in the other levels of the Tao Master's path. The enmity between them was rarely the enmity between the two camps, but more personal enmity between them. It was precisely because of this that when Lu Tong saw Luo Fan, she could easily recognize that Luo Fan was a newly ascended cultivator. Only a newly ascended cultivator could not get rid of the concept of the Tao Master's path towards the independent cultivators or the Tao Master's disciples, of course. This was only the general situation. The specific situation for each cultivator would naturally be somewhat different. After all, not every cultivator could participate in the war against the other great heavens and earths. The cultivators who did not participate in the war, whether they were independent cultivators or the Tao Master's disciples, would obviously adhere to the attitude towards each other brought about by the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. However, this was only the minority. Perhaps these few people who entered the lower levels of the Tao Master's path would have incredible influence. But in the 6th level, they were just a small minority that did not affect the overall situation. There was no need to think too much about it. From Taoist Hongqua's description, Luo Fan was able to determine when the next war would break out. In other words, the time corresponding to the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road would be the next time. The 6th level of the Tao Master's Road was filled with the Sea of Nothingness. The Sea of Nothingness was so mysterious that time and space were in a very subtle state of distortion. The structure of time and space was obviously completely different from the stable time and space in the normal world. Therefore, except for the one at the bottom, which obeyed the main time of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, many heavens actually had their own independent time. Even the different layers of the Nothingness Sea and the different islands had their own independent time. Under such circumstances, the time of war naturally had to be chosen from many independent times for it to be meaningful. Otherwise, it would be meaningless to talk about the exact time. According to Taoist Hongqua's description, the time of the next war should be tens of thousands of years later. Tens of thousands of years. This time, however, surprised Luo Fan. One must know that the information he had received previously was that he had 100 million years to stabilize his cultivation level. If he still could not pass the test in 100 million years, he would be forced to participate in the war, and then he would have the freedom to choose. It seemed that the next war should break out 100 million years later. How could it become tens of thousands of years? However, soon, he understood what was going on. The time between the two wars was not fixed, but generally speaking, it was within the range of tens of millions of years. That was to say, it could be several years, tens of thousands of years, millions of years, or tens of millions of years. The random choice between these periods would not be less than tens of thousands of years, nor more than 100 million years. Under such circumstances, 100 million years was obviously more than the interval between the two wars. The Sea of Nothingness, or in other words, the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, gave all the cultivators who had ascended 100 million years. Obviously, it did not depend on when the war broke out, but a fixed amount of time for each cultivator to stabilize their realm. Therefore, the time that Luo Fan could cultivate and stabilize his realm had nothing to do with the time of the war. Taoist friend, you are so unfamiliar with this, but now you can go deep into this level. You are really extraordinary. Taoist Hongqua looked at Luo Fan and could not help but praise. The fact that he was unfamiliar with all this meant that it had not been long since he had ascended to the 6th level of the Town Master's path. It did not take long for him to reach the depth that he had spent hundreds of millions of years to reach. This amazing talent was really shocking. In fact, if it were not for this, Taoist Hongqua would not be so friendly to Luo Fan. Although the conflict between the Tao Master's disciples and the rogue cultivators was not as strong as the previous levels, it was impossible for different cultivators to be as friendly as a family. Even the disciples of different Tao Masters had all kinds of disagreements and grudges, let alone others. Therefore, if Luo Fan had not shown his potential, if Taoist Hongqua had not thought highly of Luo Fan, he would not have answered Luo Fan's questions. This was not a secret that could not be told. Both Luo Fan and Taoist Hongqua were well aware of this. Luo Fan knew why Taoist Hongqua was friendly to him, and Taoist Hongqua also knew why Luo Fan was friendly to him. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "I just stayed in the 5th level a little longer. It's just a good preparation. There is nothing special about it." As he spoke, he changed the topic and began to discuss the Tao with Taoist Hongqua. Taoist Hongqua was very optimistic about Luo Fan's ability and admired his potential. Naturally, he was very welcome to discuss the Tao with Luo Fan. It could even be said that if Luo Fan had not shown so many doubts before, he would have already changed the topic to discuss the Tao. Under such circumstances, he naturally put other things aside and began to discuss the Tao with Luo Fan. Although he was only a 6th tribulation expert, Taoist Hongqua had after all cultivated in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path for hundreds of millions of years. It could be said that he had almost completed all kinds of cultivation at the 6th tribulation stage. It could be said that Luo Fan had obtained everything he wanted in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, at this time, this kind of Tao discussion was not useless to Luo Fan at all. He could gain great benefits at every moment and could feel his own foundation constantly being consolidated. For Luo Fan, this kind of Tao discussion was of great help. For Taoist Hongqua, this kind of Tao discussion with Luo Fan was also of great help. After all, Luo Fan's cultivation realm had reached the peak of the 7th tribulation, reaching the level of the 8th tribulation expert only a small step. So his understanding of cultivation, understanding of heaven and earth, understanding of the essence of the Tao Master's path, and even understanding of the chaos, everything was obviously better than that of a 6th tribulation expert. Although there was no way to show this strength directly, it was really contained in Luo Fan's words, in his every move, and even the traces of cultivation Tao that he showed. In this way, Taoist Hongqua and Luo Fan's Tao discussion was equivalent to constantly experiencing the cultivation Tao of an expert of a higher level. It went without saying how great the harvest would be. It could be said that at this time, the Tao discussion could be said to be absolutely a win-win situation. Since it was a win-win situation, naturally it could be continued for a long time. In just the blink of an eye, they had been discussing Tao with each other for 30 years. During these 30 years, both sides felt that they had gained a lot, and even felt that they had been reborn. As for the cave abode they were in, it had undergone earth-shaking changes during the process of their occasional experiments and harvests. Compared to the past, there was already a world of difference between the present and the past. Now, this cave abode could no longer be called a cave abode. Instead, it should be called a cluster of worlds, or even a heaven. Although this kind of heaven was still very different from the heaven formed by the light of heaven and earth. And this layer of the nothingness ocean seemed to have become completely different because of their means. The original illusory appearance had been completely changed at this time. At a glance, the entire layer of the nothingness ocean had become absolutely solid and absolutely real, although the real appearance was also very different from the beginning. On this day, as Taoist Hongqua was talking about the various subtle things that existed in a layer of the nothingness ocean, he suddenly noticed that Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. It seemed that something quite serious had suddenly happened. "What's wrong?" Taoist Hongqua stopped talking and asked with some surprise and uncertainty. In the past 30 years of Tao discussion, Taoist Hongqua had long admired Luo Fan from the bottom of his heart. Now, there was such a strong change in Luo Fan's expression, which was the first time in the past 30 years. As for what this represented, he couldn't be more clear about it. This clearly meant that some kind of change that Luo Fan did not expect, and even had no confidence in, had appeared. How could he not be curious about the fact that a person whom he admired so much could not grasp the changes that had occurred? It's just that an expected enemy has appeared. Luo Fan smiled and said. At this moment, his gaze was leisurely, as if it could penetrate the infinite obstacles and see the most lively layer of the nothingness ocean. The specific location was where his incarnation was. In that location, the original prison had completely disappeared, and the appearance of the 72 layers of Yuan had completely changed. From the original appearance of a nested world, it had turned into an island. It looked like a continent, and it had everything that a normal world would have. Inside, one could even see cultivators as powerful as false sages cultivating inside, constantly engulfing and spitting out some sort of subtle existence that existed in the nothingness ocean layer. At first glance, such an island did not seem any different from the many other islands in the nothingness ocean. However, Luo Fan could clearly sense that in the depths of this island, there were layers of islands nested behind this island, or rather, they overlapped with this island. It could be said that this was just an island on the surface, but in fact, it was a gathering of 72 islands. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation was floating outside this island with a calm expression. He held the invisible and intangible essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse in his hand. The change that made Luo Fan focus his attention here was that the essence actually began to tremble. It actually produced an indescribable struggle, as if it was going to break free from the control of Luo Fan's incarnation in the next moment. Luo Fan could not be clearer about what this change meant. This clearly meant that the owner of this essence was already close to the essence to the point that it could slightly shake his shackles on this essence. In other words, the seventh tribulation powerhouse was actually already extremely close to him, and had even come to his side. You're finally here. I thought you would arrive a little earlier. Luo Fan sighed and said. This trace of essence was clearly in his hands. This was obviously unacceptable to any seventh tribulation powerhouse. Normally, the seventh tribulation powerhouse should have descended ashore, while after the essence fell into Luo Fan's hands and started a fight with Luo Fan to take back this trace of essence. However, he had actually waited for 30 years, and the owner of this trace of essence, the seventh tribulation powerhouse, had only just arrived. This was clearly quite different from what he had expected. Let it go. At this moment, an inexplicable sigh reverberated in the void. Immediately after, Luo Fan felt layers upon layers of dimensions appear in the surrounding void. These layers of dimensions directly enveloped him, trying to separate his various attributes. The power of this separation was so strong that it felt like even an eighth tribulation powerhouse might not be able to withstand this power. Chapter 30:17. With the disappearance of the handkerchief, the boundary between the void ocean layers that had been broken due to the existence of the handkerchief was restored in an instant. The void ocean layer in this area was completely restored to how it was when Luo Fan first arrived. At a glance, it was as if nothing had happened. It was so much so that even Luo Fan's clone and the island he constructed had returned to the initial layer of nothingness, and it was impossible to tell where they had been before. Noticing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not say anything. Instead, he said to the woman, "In that case, please." The middle-aged woman looked at Luo Fan with an expressionless face. Her displeasure, unwillingness, anger, and resentment obviously wouldn't disappear because of this. However, she obviously didn't feel the need to continue to show it. Thinking about it carefully, even if she failed, she would only lose this clone. Her essence had already fallen into Luo Fan's hands. Losing this clone did not seem to be a greater loss for her. Once she won the bet, she would be able to regain her essence, and the enemy would not be able to pry into her secrets through her essence. The gains could be said to be quite considerable. Risking a small loss in exchange for a large gain, this bet didn't seem to be too much of a loss at this moment. The middle-aged woman could clearly only use this method to comfort herself. However, she was a seven-tribulation powerhouse after all, and this kind of comforting behavior could not really deceive her. No matter what, it was a fact that she was forced to accept a bet that she was unwilling to accept. Being forced in itself represented weakness, and it meant that her determination would be distorted. This was clearly extremely repulsive to a true powerhouse. Sighing inwardly, she did not say a word and turned into a stream of light, charging straight towards the overlapping islands. In the blink of an eye, she had already entered the island. The moment she entered the island, she suddenly felt an indescribable sense of reality suddenly engulf her. At this moment, she suddenly felt that everything about her seemed to be fake and extremely illusory. Her power, worldview, body, might, magic, techniques, space-time, world, heaven and earth, and even her essence seemed to be illusory and invisible. Under this feeling, she felt that her body became more and more illusory. The countless abilities and might that she possessed that could destroy the world and split the world apart began to be gradually covered at the same time. They were covered by the surrounding reality. Truth, no matter what, was always above falsehood. When illusion encountered reality, it would naturally be covered by reality, and its essence would naturally be revealed. At this time, it was the same for the middle-aged woman. Under the reflection of the incomparably real world around her, all the power, all the ideas, and all the divine abilities that she possessed seemed to have only existed in a dream. It was as if they had no effect in the real world. This was the covering of reality. This kind of covering was so powerful that even if the seven tribulation experts was extremely firm and almost unshakable, she couldn't change the progress of this covering at this moment. The surrounding reality was really too strong. Compared to it, everything she had seemed too fake. Even her will seem to have become fake in the face of this reality. It was obviously impossible to use a fake will to shake reality. Therefore, at this moment, even if her will was so firm and powerful, she couldn't change the result of her being covered by reality and her extraordinary abilities being continuously erased by reality. Not long after, her body had already brazenly fallen into the island. Or rather, she had fallen into that world. This island looked like it from the outside, but in fact, after entering the range of the island, what she saw was a complete world. At this moment, the middle-aged woman directly fell into this world like a stubborn stone. Asterisk rumble. Asterisk an earth-shattering sound rang out, and the ground shook violently, announcing her arrival at this moment. However, the ground only shook, and there wasn't even a trace of it cracking. At a glance, the entire world seemed to just shake a little, and the matter of her arrival was directly thrown aside. The middle-aged woman who fell into this world was like an illusory mountain. At first glance, it seemed that she really existed somewhere in this world. However, if one were to carefully observe and identify it, they would suddenly realize that the huge mountain seemed to be just an illusion, a mirage. This change became stronger and stronger as time passed. In other words, as time passed, the mountain became more and more illusory. It could be imagined that after a period of time, it would completely become illusory and formless, even reaching a point where real living beings couldn't see it. When that time came, it was hard to say what would happen. At this moment, the middle-aged woman felt the changes that occurred to her body in this world, and she was secretly frightened by Luo Fan's means. Previously, when she was outside this island, she had already discovered that this island was quite extraordinary, and the laws of this world were also quite strong and stable. However, she didn't expect the laws of this world to be so strong and stable that she couldn't resist at all. Ordinary living beings might not be able to imagine what would happen if she completely turned into nothingness in the eyes of real living beings in this world and became invisible. However, as a seven tribulation powerhouse who cultivated on this island, she was quite clear about what the consequences would be. The consequence was that she would be completely suppressed by this island. From then on, she would completely fuse with this island, and her fate would be completely tied to this island and could no longer be separated. When that time came, her outcome would definitely be more tragic than those 6 tribulation powerhouses who were previously imprisoned by her. She probably wouldn't even be able to control herself, let alone transcend this island and win the bet with Luo Fan. Therefore, at this moment, she knew very well that what she had to do was to break away from this continuous evolution. As she thought of this, countless flashes of wisdom surged in her heart at this moment. Countless inspirations exploded in her heart, and in the blink of an eye, countless methods appeared in her heart as these inspirations and sparks of wisdom intertwined. These countless methods naturally led to countless directions. Among them, some were useful, and some were definitely useless. Now, what the middle-aged woman needed to do was to distinguish the useful ones and the useless ones, and figure out which method was the easiest to use and the most effective at this moment. Although she had become illusory in the eyes of this island, everything about her had become fake. In reality, she was still a 7th tribulation powerhouse. Her wisdom was ultimately not something that ordinary powerhouses could compare to. At this moment, her thoughts flashed like lightning, and those methods were quickly identified in this process. What methods were useful, what methods were useless, how useful were the methods, how different were the methods from this environment, why were they useless, and so on. Everything quickly flowed through her heart at this moment. In just a few short breaths, she had already determined what she should do. This is the only way. I didn't expect that after so many years, I would have to return to that state again. The middle-aged woman sighed. Immediately afterward, the mountain that she had transformed into in this world began to rapidly shrink. As it shrank, the illusory feeling also began to rapidly diminish. When the mountain was completely compressed into a shape that was several feet tall, the illusory feeling that existed on her body had disappeared without a trace, and she looked extremely real. After being compressed to this size, she had clearly become a model of a mountain. This model shook slightly at this moment, and from the appearance of a mountain, it had already transformed into the appearance of a woman. She looked like a little girl that was only 11 or 12 years old. Her makeup was like jade, and her skin was like jade. Her entire body exuded an indescribable sense of cuteness, but it was completely different from the majestic and sacred empress that she had before. It could even be said that they were almost two extremes. At this moment, she no longer had any strength in her body. She looked like an ordinary little girl that was born and raised in this world. As expected, it succeeded. Sensing her own state, the little girl appeared to have a relaxed expression. This clearly meant that his previous plan had succeeded. She could be considered to have taken the first step in breaking away from the effects of this world's reality. She would not be completely engulfed by this world and the island itself, and would not be unable to escape. Of course, this was only the first step in breaking away. She was still very far away from truly transcending this island and winning the bet with Luo Fan. I must obtain extraordinary abilities to explore this world, find loopholes in this world, and then transcend. The little girl appeared to have a resolute expression. What she had used before was to compress all of her power, all of her abilities, all of her techniques, all of her might, all of her thoughts, and so on. Using this extreme compression, she made the illusory surpass the real. This allowed her to break away from the ending of being engulfed by the real, allowing her to exist in this new state in this world. The real and the illusory were in opposite states. The real could overshadow the illusory, but if the illusory was powerful to a certain extent, it could also overshadow the real. It was just like the truth and the lie. The truth could indeed pass the test, and no one would be able to find any flaws in it no matter how hard they tried. However, if the lie was really tight to a certain extent, it could also achieve the same effect. The relationship between the real and the illusory was the same. Of course, relatively speaking, it was much more difficult for the illusory to overshadow the real than for the real to overshadow the illusory. This was especially so in this island, or rather, in this world. In order to overshadow the real, so that she would not be seen as an illusion, the Seven Tribulations powerhouse had clearly paid a huge price. Everything she had was used to maintain her current state. At least in the eyes of this world, she had truly turned into a little girl. She was a little girl without any power or supernatural abilities. Therefore, at this moment, if she wanted to do more in this world, she clearly had to find a new extraordinary ability, one that was completely rooted in this world. Only in this way could she do what she wanted to do. In fact, only then could she continue to survive in this world. One should not forget that this world was not a paradise. This was a complete world. Her current landing point was in the wilderness of this world. There were countless living beings that abided by the laws of nature in the surroundings. If she did not have extraordinary abilities, given her body as a little girl, it was questionable how long she could survive in this place. Just as the little girl was deep in thought, a wave of killing intent suddenly locked onto her body. She instantly knew that this was a sign that the wild beasts around her had discovered her existence. This kind of killing intent was not considered strong. In fact, it could even be said to be something that did not exist in reality. It was only because her senses were extremely sharp and powerful that she could sense this kind of illusory intent. After sensing this kind of killing intent, the little girl knew that she could not delay any longer. With a thought, she leaped up and jumped onto a tree at the side. After a few leaps, she had already gone deep into the surrounding forest. After all, she was a Seven Tribulations powerhouse, and her ability to use power was not something that ordinary living creatures could compare to. Although the power she possessed was only the normal power of a little girl, with her ability to control power, she could use the little girl's physical strength to create a flower. Jumping from tree to tree was obviously not a difficult task for her. Of course, this action of hers was only slightly delaying the time for the wild beasts to catch her. The wild beasts' methods of using power were not as exquisite as hers. However, they were ultimately much stronger than the little girl. If she could not grasp extraordinary abilities in time, it would not take long for her to be caught and eaten. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3018. This woman could use some tricks to mobilize power that was thousands of times stronger than what she possessed. However, the enemy's own power was thousands of times stronger than hers. What advantage did she have? The woman was very clear about this. As for how to obtain extraordinary powers from nothing, this Seven Tribulation expert was naturally very clear about it. It must be known that she had opened a prison here previously. In that prison, the Six Tribulation powerhouses were completely imprisoned by her. The process of them obtaining extraordinary powers was countless times more difficult than obtaining extraordinary powers from nothing. After witnessing so many Six Tribulation powerhouses obtaining extraordinary powers under such difficult circumstances, she naturally had her own insights on how to obtain extraordinary powers as quickly as possible. Therefore, at this moment, the little girl began to adjust her breathing as she moved forward in the forest. Through this adjustment, she continued to resonate with this world. Her adjustment was quickly met with a response. This world was not the prison island that she had opened previously. There were no strict restrictions on the extraordinary powers that living beings could obtain here. To this world, as long as one complied with certain rules and did not touch the taboo of this world, one would be qualified to set foot on the extraordinary path and obtain extraordinary powers. Evidently, even though this little girl was forced to enter this world by Luo Fan, in the eyes of this world, there was nothing special about her. Therefore, at this moment, it treated the little girl's efforts to obtain extraordinary powers equally. As a result, a lustrous light gradually appeared on her body as she breathed. In this kind of light, her body became lighter and lighter, as if her weight was gradually reduced. Then, at a certain moment, her body suddenly shook, and she suddenly broke free from gravity. She soared into the sky, and in a flash, she had already traversed a distance of tens of thousands of miles. She directly left this mountain range and left the many wild beasts that were eyeing her covetously behind her. After leaving the mountain range, the little girl did not stop. Instead, she became faster and faster. At first, one could still see a small figure in the lustrous light. However, when her speed broke through a certain limit, her figure had already disappeared without a trace. At a glance, one could only see the lustrous light traversing the void. One could not see her original figure at all. Of course, this did not attract much attention from the cultivators in this world. Even if he had already obtained supernatural powers and was beginning to transcend the mortal world, it was still extremely insignificant compared to the cultivation civilization of this world. Don't forget that this world has already given birth to sage-to-be cultivators. Such a world of cultivation was naturally of a very low level compared to a normal perfect world or a great world. It was even far inferior to the world that Luo Fan had casually created in the past. However, on an absolute level, it was already quite brilliant. At the very least, compared to ordinary creatures, this level was already quite high. The little girl had only just obtained her supernatural powers. In the cultivation world, she was clearly at the bottom of the bottom. She was like a tiny ant among countless behemoths. How could she attract much attention? Therefore, at this time, even though the little girl had turned into a lustrous light and was shuttling through the void at high speed, crossing thousands of kilometers in an instant, she did not attract much attention. In this state, the little girl was deepening her understanding of this world and the laws of this world at every moment. Through this kind of deepening, she continuously deepened and expanded her extraordinary abilities. In the end, after maintaining this state for an entire month, her body suddenly stopped. She instantly broke away from her original state of flowing light and reappeared in the void. The sparkling light on his body also disappeared in an instant, as if it had never appeared in the first place. On the contrary, an increasingly powerful aura started to emerge from her body. With every breath, her aura rose by a level. In just a few dozen breaths, she had actually broken through the barrier of the celestial being realm and surpassed the boundary of life and death. She had achieved a realm similar to the rogue, immortal realm in this world of cultivation. It's a pity that this is as far as I can go. The woman sighed at this moment, feeling rather regretful. The laws of this world were rather strict and stable. With her abilities, this was all she could achieve in a short period of time. If she wanted to continue breaking through and improving, she clearly needed to deepen her understanding of this world's cultivation world and the essence of this world. This was clearly not something that could be achieved just by continuing like this. That was why she had stopped at this moment and revealed herself. However, although the performance is completely different, this kind of training method is somewhat similar to the training method in my prison. This judgment surfaced in the little girl's heart as she sensed the strength in her body that seemed extremely weak, but was actually quite considerable. Her cultivation method was completely created according to the laws of this world. It was the most compatible with the laws of this world and her own cultivation method. Even though this cultivation method was different from the orthodox cultivation method in this world, there was not much difference in essence. After all, the orthodox cultivation method in this world was also born from the laws of this world, and it was essentially no different from the cultivation method that she had created. Since the essence was the same, the performance would naturally be similar as well. Therefore, at this moment, the cultivation characteristics that she sensed from the cultivation method that she had organized could naturally be extended to the orthodox cultivation method in this world. Perhaps this will become an important breakthrough point. Then, she suddenly had a flash of inspiration, and a faint smile suddenly appeared on her face. Following that, she noticed where she was now. She was no longer in the wilderness, but in a civilized country. Although she was not in a city, she was not too far away from a city. Although the world of cultivation in this world had developed to an extremely high level and had even given birth to demisage realm cultivators, it was still not enough. However, this did not mean that this world was filled with immortals. Immortals, even itinerant immortals, actually did not often appear in front of ordinary people in this world. At this moment, in the civilized country that the little girl was in, there were only a few cultivators above the itinerant immortal realm who had transcended the boundary of life and death in the little girl's perception range. Although there were quite a few remaining cultivators, almost all of them were much weaker than the cultivation that she had displayed right now. Therefore, in such a country, the little girl could still have a rather high status. The little girl was also an experienced seventh tribulation powerhouse. After a little perception of the situation in this civilized country, she naturally knew what kind of attitude she could use to obtain the information she wanted. With a slight thought, she concealed her aura and arrived at the nearest city nearby. Her current cultivation method was completely based on the expansion of the extraordinary power that she had obtained in a mountain range. The extraordinary power that she had obtained at the beginning was obviously focused on speed. Therefore, the speed that she could display at this moment was extremely impressive. There were many cultivators in this city, but the strongest among them was still a level away from the boundary of heaven and man. This was obviously the kind of cultivator that she could easily control. What the little girl wanted the most now was to figure out the cultivation system in this world. If possible, it would be even better if she could find out the secrets hidden in this world. Of course, she didn't have much hope for the latter. After all, there were quasi-sage cultivators in the cultivation world in this world. The strongest cultivators in this city were even a level away from the boundary of heaven and man, and they were dozens of levels away from quasi-sage cultivators. It went without saying that they could reach a certain level in this world. At that level, it was easy to imagine what secrets they knew in this world. What was there to look forward to? Very soon, the little girl had already arrived before the cultivator. Her aura instantly enveloped the cultivator, making him feel as if his entire body had been bound by countless shackles. It was as if a disaster would befall him if he moved even the slightest bit. "Who is it?" he cried out in surprise. Very quickly, he saw the owner of the aura and saw the source of the power that made him feel like an ant. When he saw the little girl, he instantly cowered, and the aura on his body was immediately withdrawn. His expression became extremely honest, and he even seemed a little simple and honest. "What orders do you have for me, Senior? I won't say a word, even if I have to use up all my wealth," he cried out. The cultivator had the appearance of an old man with the demeanor of an immortal. However, his fawning manner did not seem out of place at all. It seemed so natural that the little girl could not help but be slightly taken aback. After a while, she said with an indescribable expression, "You have a good eye. You know your limits. You should be able to live for a long time." The old man seemed to be very excited by her praise. He hurriedly said, "Thank you for your praise, Senior. In fact, many seniors have said the same thing." The little girl instantly lost interest in continuing to talk about this matter when she saw that he wasn't ashamed, but was instead proud of himself. She immediately asked about the things she wanted to know, asking about cultivation methods, and cultivation systems was something that would be very suspicious. After all, the strength that the little girl had displayed was already quite powerful. At the very least, she was quite powerful compared to the old man. With such powerful strength, no matter what, she should have cultivated before, right? Since she had cultivated before, she should naturally have cultivation methods, and cultivation systems. How could she ask about this and the 4 cultivation methods, and cultivation systems? However, the old man did not hesitate to tell her all the information that the little girl needed. It could be said that he had told her everything he knew without holding anything back. Throughout the entire process, he did not show any doubt at all. This made the little girl quite satisfied. She felt that she was really lucky to have found such a cultivator. Just as the little girl had expected, the old man knew very little about the secrets of this world. Even if he thought that it was a secret that other powerhouses did not know, in reality, it was something that the little girl could sense at a glance. It was of no help to her at all. While the little girl was constantly exploring the island, outside the island, Luo Fan was overlooking everything that was happening below with a condescending gaze. The little girl's every move, and even all the changes that happened to her body, were all revealed in his eyes. So that's how she thinks. In that case, the information and the essence should be strung together in another way. While watching the little girl's actions, such a thought flashed through his mind. It was because he was observing the little girl or rather, the way of thinking of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. He planned to grasp the way of thinking of the seventh tribulation powerhouse, the arrangement of the information in the essence, and the way of construction. The final goal was to thoroughly understand the countless messy information in the essence, and how to reconstruct the true memory, true path of cultivation, and true worldview of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Of course, the seventh tribulation powerhouse walked the right path, so his worldview had not truly taken shape yet. Right now, his worldview should still exist in the form of countless scattered ideas, of course. This was not a process that could be completed easily. Not to mention how complicated and subtle the way of thinking of the little girl or the seventh tribulation powerhouse was. What she showed in that world was probably only a millionth of the true process of thinking. It was extremely difficult to reconstruct the entire process of thinking from this millionth of the content. Simply speaking, whether the way of thinking of the seventh tribulation powerhouse was the true way of thinking was a question mark. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version.